The Pacific Northwest is a landscape of shadowed forests, jagged mountains and hidden caves where sunlight barely touches the moss-draped ground. Here, among ancient conifers and mist-laden valleys, the line between the known and the unknowable blurs. Over decades, explorers, trappers and curious wanderers have recorded incidents that defy explanation. Missing timber crews, cryptic footprints in volcanic ash, and underground caverns that seem untouched by time. Each report hints at a presence both elusive and unsettling, an environment that shapes perception as much as it shelters its secrets. Through this compilation, you will trace the paths of those who ventured into these forbidding forests, encountering Ape Canyon's violent echoes, the frozen silence of remote trappers' territories, and the labyrinthine lava tubes of Mount St. Helens. You will follow the meticulous investigations, conflicting testimonies, and unexplained phenomena that continue to confound researchers. Step carefully through these shadows, and you may glimpse the mysteries that the Pacific Northwest has long kept hidden. The Lava Lake Trapper Murders. Snow settles differently in the high country south of Bend, Oregon, where the Deschutes National Forest stretches across volcanic soil and quiet lakes that freeze into pale mirrors each winter. Pine trunks rise in dense rows, absorbing sound until even a distant footstep feels uncertain, and narrow trails disappear beneath drifts that reshape the landscape overnight. In this isolated region near Lava Lake, trappers once built rough cabins and followed trap lines that cut through miles of unbroken forest, trusting routine and distance to keep them safe. The stillness of the area would later frame one of the Pacific Northwest's most unsettling unsolved cases, remembered as the Lava Lake Trapper Murders, a crime discovered only after weeks of silence had already erased much of what might have explained it. During the early 1920s, the trapping trade remained a demanding winter occupation that required long periods of solitude. Men travelled by snowshoe across frozen ground, carrying supplies that had to last through storms that could close mountain passes without warning. Lava Lake itself sits at an elevation where ice forms thick enough to support sleds, and seasonal cabins were often positioned close to the shoreline so trappers could move quickly between lines. Isolation was not unusual, but it meant that when routine stopped, there were few immediate witnesses to notice. The forest around the lake carries a muted atmosphere even in daylight, shaped by dense stands of lodgepole pine and uneven volcanic terrain left behind by ancient eruptions. Wind moves across the frozen surface in slow, low gusts that seem to flatten sound rather than carry it, creating a landscape where human presence feels temporary. Rangers and residents knew that winter could hide problems for weeks at a time, and small changes such as an unvisited trail or an unlit cabin might go unnoticed until the season shifted. Long before investigators arrived, the environment had already begun altering the story. Snow hardened and softened with temperature changes, covering tracks that might have revealed who moved through the area and when. Ice thickened across the lake's surface, sealing whatever lay beneath it, while drifting powder blurred the edges of campsites and travel routes. By the time concern finally reached nearby communities, the forest had settled back into silence, leaving only scattered clues hidden within a landscape that seemed determined to keep its distance. The first indication that something was wrong near Lava Lake did not arrive as a sudden alarm, but as a gradual unease that settled among those familiar with the rhythms of winter trapping. Trappers working nearby noticed that routine signs of activity had stopped appearing along the routes that led toward the lake. Snowshoe tracks that should have been renewed after storms remained undisturbed, and the narrow corridor leading to the cabin showed no evidence of recent passage. In a landscape where isolation was common, this absence was initially explained away as a weather delay, or a decision to remain sheltered until conditions improved. As days passed, concern began to sharpen. Smoke no longer rose from the cabin's chimney, a detail that carried weight in a season when fire meant survival. Supplies were typically managed carefully, and prolonged inactivity suggested either illness or trouble severe enough to prevent even short trips outside. Eventually, word reached others in the region who understood that while winter solitude was expected, complete silence was not. A small group moved toward Lava Lake to check on the trappers, travelling across frozen terrain that offered no clear indication of what awaited them. The approach to the cabin revealed little at first. The structure stood intact against the snow, its door closed, and no obvious signs of forced entry or struggle were visible from a distance. Inside, belongings appeared largely undisturbed, with equipment and supplies still present, suggesting that the men had not abandoned the site intentionally. This discovery deepened the mystery rather than resolving it, because it pointed away from an orderly departure and toward an interruption that had taken place beyond the cabin walls. Attention soon shifted to the area surrounding the lake. Searchers scanned the frozen surface and nearby shoreline for tracks or disturbances, eventually noticing irregular patterns in the snow that did not align with natural drift alone. The marks were subtle, partially obscured by subsequent snowfall, but distinct enough to suggest that something heavy had been moved across the ice. This realization reframed the search, transforming a welfare check into something far more serious. Cutting through the ice revealed the first body beneath the lake's surface. The recovery required deliberate effort, as the ice had thickened considerably during the weeks of winter cold. When Roy Wilson was brought up from beneath the frozen water, the discovery confirmed that the situation was not the result of accident or exposure alone. The presence of a body concealed under the ice immediately suggested intent, raising questions about how and why such an act had been carried out in a place so remote. Further searches led to the recovery of the remaining two men, Edward Nichols and Dewey Morris, also found beneath the ice. The positioning of the bodies indicated they had been deliberately placed there, rather than falling through naturally. Investigators noted gunshot wounds, reinforcing the conclusion that violence had occurred before the concealment. Yet the scene offered no clear sequence of events, only the stark reality that 3 trappers had died and that the forest had concealed the evidence long enough to complicate every answer. The discovery forced investigators to consider timelines shaped by winter conditions rather than precise clocks. Snowfall, ice formation, and temperature shifts all played a role in obscuring when the killings had taken place. Witnesses could only offer estimates based on their last encounters with the men, leaving a broad window during which the events might have occurred. Each passing day between disappearance and discovery widened the gap between action and understanding. What made the scene especially unsettling was how ordinary it appeared beyond the ice. There were no signs of prolonged struggle near the cabin, no scattered equipment suggesting panic or flight. The forest seemed indifferent, holding no visible reaction to what had happened. This lack of immediate explanation set the tone for the investigation that followed, one defined not by dramatic revelation, but by careful reconstruction and persistent uncertainty. News of the discovery travelled slowly at first, carried by word of mouth through small communities scattered across central Oregon. What began as a quiet welfare check quickly drew the attention of local authorities once the presence of gunshot wounds was confirmed. Deputies and investigators moved into the area, despite difficult winter travel, relying on sleds and snowshoes to reach a scene that had already been altered by weeks of weather. Each arrival added new footprints to the snow, complicating efforts to distinguish between original evidence and the marks left by those trying to understand it. Initial reports focused on documenting what remained visible before conditions changed again. Investigators examined the cabin, the shoreline, and the surface of Lava Lake, attempting to trace how the bodies might have been moved. The lack of obvious struggle inside the structure suggested that the violence had occurred elsewhere, perhaps outdoors, where drifting snow had since softened the edges of any confrontation. Firearms found at the site became central to early theories, but without modern forensic tools, conclusions depended heavily on interpretation rather than certainty. Residents who'd known the trappers offered statements that reflected both familiarity and unease. Some described the men as experienced outdoorsmen who understood the risks of winter isolation, while others hinted at disagreements that might have grown under pressure. These recollections were filtered through the shock of discovery, creating a mixture of first-hand observation and rumour that investigators had to weigh carefully. In small forest communities, personal reputation often carried as much influence as physical evidence, shaping how each person involved was perceived. Search efforts expanded beyond the immediate cabin area, as authorities looked for signs of additional participants or witnesses. Rangers and volunteers combed nearby trails, following faint impressions that might have indicated travel toward or away from the lake. Yet every hour spent in the snow risked altering the landscape further, and investigators faced the paradox of needing to search thoroughly while preserving what little remained of the original scene. The forest seemed to resist clarity, offering fragments that could be arranged into multiple narratives depending on who interpreted them. As details reached newspapers, the case began to attract attention beyond the immediate region. Headlines emphasized the unusual nature of the discovery beneath the ice, and early articles speculated about motives ranging from disputes over trapping territory to sudden violence triggered by isolation. These reports influenced public perception, sometimes amplifying uncertainty by presenting incomplete information as definitive. Investigators worked against both the environment and the growing pressure to provide answers, aware that speculation could overshadow facts still being gathered. The theory that Edward Nichols might have killed the other two men before taking his own life emerged during this phase of the investigation. Authorities pointed to the presence of a weapon and the apparent sequence suggested by body positioning, framing the incident as a murder-suicide that explained the absence of outside suspects. Yet not everyone accepted this interpretation immediately. Some questioned whether the physical demands of subduing two experienced trappers and concealing them beneath thick ice were realistic for a single individual working alone in harsh winter conditions. The weather continued to influence every step of the inquiry. Sudden temperature shifts hardened the snowpack, preserving certain impressions while erasing others, and winds swept across the lake's surface, covering disturbed areas with fresh layers of powder. Investigators had to rely on written notes and sketches to capture what they observed, knowing that the environment would not hold the scene in place for long. The sense that time itself was working against them created a quiet urgency that shaped the investigation's tone. Conflicting testimonies began to emerge as more people were interviewed. Some witnesses recalled minor tensions among the trappers, while others insisted the men had appeared cooperative during previous encounters. These differences did not provide clear answers, but they added complexity to the narrative, suggesting that the truth might lie somewhere between official conclusions and personal recollections. Each statement introduced new variables, turning the case into a puzzle defined as much by human memory as by physical evidence. By the end of this early phase, the Lava Lake Trapper murders had shifted from a localized tragedy to a regional mystery shaped by speculation, incomplete data, and the relentless pressure of winter. Investigators stood at a crossroads, balancing practical conclusions with lingering doubts about what had truly occurred on the frozen lake, aware that every decision made during these weeks would shape how the case was remembered for decades to come. Even after bodies were recovered and the official investigation began, the details of the Lava Lake Trapper murders resisted any tidy explanation. Investigators faced a scene fragmented by time, weather, and distance, where snow had softened footprints, ice had concealed evidence, and weeks of winter had erased subtle signs of struggle. Every effort to reconstruct what had occurred relied on inference, on careful measurement of what remained rather than what had been lost, and on testimonies that sometimes conflicted in ways investigators could not reconcile. The forest itself seemed indifferent, leaving no witness to testify beyond the frozen lake and silent cabins that had long held their secrets. Examination of the recovered bodies raised as many questions as it answered. The positioning beneath the ice suggested deliberate placement, yet details about how the men had been moved remained elusive. The first body recovered, that of Roy Wilson, was found partially submerged near the shoreline, where investigators debated whether he had fallen during an altercation or had been carried there after death. Edward Nichols' body bore wounds consistent with firearms, leading authorities to suspect that he had been both victim and potential perpetrator, though no eyewitness could confirm the sequence. Dewey Morris's remains added further complexity, showing signs of trauma that did not clearly indicate a timeline or order of events. Forensic capacity in 1924 was limited. Bullet calibers and positions were recorded, but no ballistic matching as modern investigators would expect could be conducted. Ice cores and snow conditions were examined only in passing, leaving investigators to rely on observation, deduction, and the practical experience of those accustomed to the wilderness. Each interpretation had to contend with the environment's constant interference, where temperature swings altered evidence and even careful measurements could be rendered inaccurate by frost or thaw. In this sense, the forest acted as an uncooperative witness, preserving fragments while erasing the critical parts of the story. Complicating matters further were the inconsistencies in witness statements. Some locals emphasized Nichols' temper or past disagreements with the other men, while others recalled a man steady and dependable in the harshest winter conditions. These differing memories shaped how authorities constructed motives and timelines, introducing ambiguity at every stage. Forensic evidence alone could not confirm or deny these character assessments, leaving investigators to weigh subjective impressions against the partial physical record. The result was a narrative that appeared plausible on paper, but remained riddled with unanswered questions in practice. The logistics of moving bodies beneath thick ice became a central point of speculation and debate. Investigators questioned whether a single person could have executed such actions alone, in temperatures well below freezing, with snowdrifts obscuring the terrain and ice that could shift unexpectedly. Some posited that the bodies had been placed immediately after death, before ice thickened, while others suggested that manipulation occurred over several days, relying on conditions that could not be verified retrospectively. Each theory had to reconcile with the physical limitations imposed by the environment, but none could be proven definitively. Further deepening the mystery were details that seemed trivial at first but later proved significant in reconstructing timelines. Firearms were found at the site, some loaded, some not, raising questions about intent and sequence. The cabin remained largely undisturbed, offering no clear sign of internal conflict, yet the placement of supplies and personal items hinted at activity frozen mid-routine. Even the condition of the snow on the shore suggested movement that could not be matched perfectly to any one individual, leaving investigators to consider multiple scenarios that might never be fully resolved. Historical records show that these ambiguities were compounded by the investigative methods of the era. Police and deputies relied heavily on deduction and local knowledge, rather than standardized evidence collection. Each observation was subject to interpretation, and the physical landscape both aided and obstructed understanding. In combination with conflicting personal accounts, the result was a case in which every piece of evidence carried multiple potential meanings, reinforcing the sense that the forest had absorbed the truth and left only fragments for human scrutiny. In addition to the physical reconstruction, investigators also explored behavioral and psychological factors. The isolation inherent to winter trapping, combined with potential interpersonal tensions, became part of the discussion, although no definitive motive could be confirmed. Experts noted that prolonged solitude in extreme conditions could produce both inadvertent mistakes and deliberate violence, yet the exact role of these pressures remained speculative in the absence of direct observation. The forest, ever indifferent, offered no answers, allowing the possibilities to expand in the absence of certainty. Even decades later, researchers and historians who revisit the case find the same gaps persist. Photographs, written reports, and newspaper articles provide a framework for understanding, but each layer adds interpretive choices rather than concrete closure. The lingering inconsistencies continue to fuel debate about the precise sequence of events, the plausibility of single versus multiple actors, and the role of environmental factors in shaping both action and perception. The case remains a study in how human intention interacts with an uncooperative wilderness, leaving the truth tantalizingly just beyond reach. The Deschutes National Forest, encompassing more than 1.6 million acres of high desert, lava fields, and dense pine stands, has long been a region defined by isolation and harsh winter conditions. Even before the 1920s, trappers, hunters, and early settlers understood that survival depended as much on knowledge of the terrain as on skill with firearms or trade networks. Trails were often poorly marked, and snowfall could transform familiar paths into dangerous labyrinths, where a single misstep could leave a person stranded for days. In this environment, the forest itself was not hostile in a conventional sense, yet it exercised a quiet dominion over those who travelled its frozen corridors. Historically, Lava Lake and its surroundings had seen frequent small-scale disputes among trappers over territory and access to prime lines. Fur-bearing animals such as marten and mink were not evenly distributed, and competition could produce tension, sometimes spilling over into altercations that left little trace beyond rumour. Winters of the era offered no modern means of rapid communication, so even routine disagreements could escalate unseen. The forest, indifferent to human conflict, retained only the evidence the participants themselves left behind, often obscured within days by snow and ice. Environmental conditions also shaped the practical realities of survival and investigation. The lake, while frozen solid for much of the season, could conceal hazards beneath its smooth surface. Ice thickness varied according to currents, submerged springs and recent weather, making traversal risky. Moving or dragging a body required both strength and opportunity, and any miscalculation could result in further concealment or accidental discovery. In a landscape governed by these variables, investigators quickly realized that physical evidence might not align neatly with human expectations of sequence or logic. The forest's indifference extended to the subtle signs of human activity. Snowdrifts, frost and wind could erase tracks almost as soon as they were made, and even a carefully documented cabin interior could yield little indication of recent events. Trees that might have borne marks of a struggle were often too distant or hidden within dense stands, and the natural soundscape muted movement across the snow, leaving observers uncertain how far or fast someone had travelled. These factors contributed to the persistent ambiguity surrounding the murders and highlighted the limits of reconstruction in such terrain. Broader historical patterns also provide perspective. The early 20th century saw repeated incidents of isolated violence in the Pacific Northwest, often tied to remote trapping or logging operations. Cases similar to Lava Lake, where bodies were discovered days or weeks after disappearance, evidence was sparse, and witnesses were limited, illustrate how winter isolation could turn routine work into situations fraught with danger. In many instances, conclusions relied on circumstantial reasoning rather than definitive proof, and the environmental context often played as much of a role in shaping outcomes as human decision-making. The forest, in its quiet persistence, preserved the memory of these events even as it obscured critical details, leaving only fragments for later investigators to interpret. Understanding the Lava Lake Trapper murders within this historical and environmental frame illuminates why even a relatively straightforward homicide became so difficult to unravel. Isolation, competition, and the unyielding winter landscape combined to produce a setting in which clarity was never guaranteed. Investigators had to navigate not only the unknown intentions of the individuals involved, but also the natural processes that had already begun to obscure the sequence of events. In this way, the forest itself became an active participant in the unfolding mystery, preserving silence where answers might have existed. The official ruling that Edward Nichols had likely killed Roy Wilson and Dewey Morris before taking his own life brought a form of closure on paper, but it did little to settle the lingering unease in the communities near Lava Lake. Locals continued to speak in hushed tones about the men who had vanished beneath the ice, recounting fragments of memory that contradicted official conclusions or suggested alternative possibilities. Hunters and trappers who followed in their footsteps were reminded with each passing winter of the forest's capacity to conceal and confuse, where even routine isolation could take on a sense of foreboding. In the decades that followed, the story entered the regional consciousness not as sensationalized news, but as a quiet warning of the forest's indifference. Photographs of Lava Lake, its surface frozen and still, appeared in local archives alongside newspaper clippings documenting the investigation, preserving both the physical and narrative record of the tragedy. Visitors to the area often noted the juxtaposition between the serene, seemingly untouched landscape and the dark history it harbored, creating a lingering sense that the forest had absorbed both violence and secrecy without alteration. The case also shaped how subsequent search and rescue operations were conducted in the region. Winter conditions had played a decisive role in obscuring evidence, teaching authorities that timeliness was critical when investigating disappearances in remote areas. Rangers developed more systematic patrols and documentation methods, and community members became more vigilant, sharing observations in ways that might prevent similar tragedies. Yet even with these measures, Lava Lake remained a place where the margin for error was minimal and where human intent could be frustrated by natural forces. Historians and researchers revisiting the case have often reflected on the gaps left by both environment and era. Without modern forensic tools, the reconstruction depended on interpretation, leaving questions about sequence, motive, and method unresolved. Even today, discussions focus as much on what the forest concealed as on what it revealed, underscoring the ongoing tension between human investigation and the impartial witness of nature. The silence of the snow, the hidden contours of the ice, and the density of the trees continue to remind anyone who studies the case that not all answers survive the winter. Ultimately, the Lava Lake Trapper murders persist as a cautionary tale embedded in the Pacific Northwest's history. Its significance lies less in dramatic details than in the enduring uncertainty it evokes. The men's deaths, the forest's quiet witness, and the unresolved questions about motive and method converge into a narrative that continues to occupy the space between fact and speculation, ensuring that the forest in its own way guards the truth. And as winter winds sweep across the frozen surface of Lava Lake, covering every trace of human presence beneath layers of ice and snow, the forest holds its silence, leaving the truth of that long-past night suspended in the cold air. The night the miners claimed the forest fought back. Ape Canyon, 1924. The slopes of Mount St. Helens in 1924 were a place both beautiful and unforgiving, a rugged expanse of jagged lava flows, dense evergreens, and silent ridges that seemed to stretch forever. The forest clung to the volcanic soil, its dark pines swaying in wind gusts that carried the scent of sulfur and cold mountain air. Trails were few, carved roughly by miners and trappers who understood that every step carried risk, and the terrain itself could turn familiar paths into disorienting mazes. Shadows fell early in winter, and pockets of darkness pooled beneath tree canopies, making the forest feel alive with movement, even when none could be seen. In such a setting, isolation was not merely a hazard, it was a companion, patient and unyielding. Mining cabins perched precariously along narrow ridges, their wooden frames standing against both storms and the ceaseless weight of snow. Inhabitants knew that the forest was indifferent to human labour, indifferent to schedules, and indifferent to the lives that passed through it. Even routine activities like hauling ore or tending equipment required vigilance, for the combination of wind, rocky terrain, and deep snow could turn a momentary lapse into disaster. These were the conditions that framed the events later remembered as the Ape Canyon encounter, a night in which ordinary vigilance would collide with something entirely unexpected. Mount St. Helens' volcanic slopes created a natural theatre for sound and perception to be altered. Narrow canyons echoed footsteps across miles, while distant winds created the illusion of movement among trees and rocks. Miners familiar with the rhythms of the terrain were still susceptible to misperception, their senses stretched by fatigue, cold, and the constant knowledge of isolation. By the time the first strange occurrences were reported, the forest itself had already begun shaping the story, concealing distances and masking the source of noises that would later terrify those present. Snow had already begun accumulating in the higher elevations, muffling ordinary forest sounds and preserving subtle disturbances that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Tracks of wildlife were scattered across ridges and slopes, their patterns overlapping and shifting with the wind, creating ambiguous evidence that invited speculation. Amid the stillness, the volcanic soil and twisted pine roots formed a labyrinth of obstacles, amplifying the sense that the forest was not merely a backdrop but an active presence, capable of both concealment and confrontation. It was against this landscape, in the bitter cold and quiet menace of the forested ridges, that the miners of the 1920s would come to feel their routines unravel. The isolation that had once offered both protection and solitude began to press in as a weight, each shadow a potential threat, each echo a question unanswered. Long before the night of the alleged encounter, the volcanic wilderness of Ape Canyon had already set the stage for fear, crafting a scene in which ordinary labour could suddenly feel extraordinary, and in which the forest itself seemed capable of responding to those who dared enter it. Life in Ape Canyon during the early 1920s was defined by a mixture of endurance, monotony, and constant attention to the environment. Miners rose before dawn, stoking small wood stoves that offered only temporary warmth, and then made their way to the rocky slopes where ore veins had been located in years prior. Each task carried the weight of isolation. A slip pick or a misjudged foothold could leave a man stranded for hours, or worse. The forest surrounding them was both familiar and unpredictable, a network of narrow ridges, hidden crevices, and volcanic boulders that had shaped human activity there for decades. Despite their experience, miners began noticing oddities in late summer and early autumn of 1924. Tools left overnight sometimes appeared displaced, though no wind or storm could account for it. Occasionally, the clatter of rocks tumbling down ridges could not be traced to any human presence. Tracks, large and indistinct, unlike those of deer or bear, were reported near supply caches, yet vanished without a trace, melted into the forest floor or obscured by drifted soil. Some dismissed these as natural anomalies or the imagination of men exhausted by isolation, but others felt a creeping tension, a sense that they were being observed in a way the forest itself had never permitted before. The miners' daily routines, once predictable and almost ritualistic, began to shift under this subtle pressure. Cabins were checked repeatedly, gates and supply boxes were examined multiple times a day, and small groups lingered together more often than usual. Even the most stoic of men, accustomed to solitude and hard work, acknowledged in private moments that something beyond ordinary wilderness risk seemed present. Sounds that would normally be ignored were now catalogued carefully: distant scraping, low thuds among the rocks, or fleeting shadows glimpsed between tree trunks. Reports from the miners also noted unusual animal behaviour. Wolves and coyotes, common in the region, were observed at odd hours and in unexpected areas, their howls louder, sharper, and closer than expected. Birds vanished from tree lines that had previously held their nests. These subtle shifts in the natural order contributed to a growing unease. Within the small enclave of cabins, the men began comparing notes, each sharing observations that when isolated might have seemed mundane, but together painted a picture of a forest that had changed its patterns in ways they could neither control nor explain. Supplies began to appear missing, sometimes small and seemingly inconsequential: tools, food, a canvas tarp. But the frequency and consistency made it impossible to dismiss entirely. Footprints, when found, were often too large, too irregular, or oddly shaped, leaving the men questioning whether they had encountered something human at all. Attempts to follow tracks frequently ended in confusion as they disappeared into boulders or thin pine cover. The miners' sense of confidence in their environment began to erode, replaced with a persistent wariness. Each day felt like a rehearsal for something far more serious than routine mining operations. By the time night fell in early September, the tension had become palpable. The miners, who had once moved through the canyon with casual efficiency, now approached work with heightened alertness. Shadows seemed to linger longer than light would allow. Noises echoed in patterns that suggested intention rather than chance, and the forest's isolation amplified every small irregularity. It was in this atmosphere, cultivated over weeks of observation, that the first reported attack would occur, a night when the forest itself, as the miners would later claim, seemed to strike back with a force both sudden and inexplicable. Night fell over Ape Canyon with a quiet that carried farther than the miners expected, the air cold and thick with the scent of wet pine and volcanic rock. Shadows pooled beneath the dense canopy, swallowing familiar ridges and boulders, and even the wind seemed to move with deliberation, slipping through trees in patterns that obscured direction and distance. In the cabins, the men gathered around small stoves, their lanterns casting trembling light against wooden walls, exchanging reports of the day's strange observations. Fatigue and vigilance hung together uneasily, each miner alert to every snap of twig or shifting shadow beyond the perimeter. The first unusual sounds arrived just after midnight, low and deliberate, rolling over the frozen forest floor in irregular pulses. At first, the miners thought it was the usual shifting of rocks or the wind catching against trees, yet the noise carried an uncanny weight, almost as if it were coordinated, deliberate. One miner swore he saw a silhouette moving among the rocks at a distance, larger than any man he had ever encountered and impossibly quick. Another reported a sound like heavy footsteps crunching over frozen debris, yet when they scanned the forest with lanterns, nothing appeared. The contrast between auditory clarity and visual absence created an unsettling uncertainty, a sense that something unseen was assessing their position with careful attention. Moments later, small rocks struck the cabins, bouncing from roof to walls with unnerving precision. The miners moved quickly to the windows, peering into darkness that seemed to resist illumination, but saw only trees swaying under a shifting wind. Yet more rocks came, some dislodged from the nearby ridges, others apparently aimed in a way that defied the random patterns of nature. Fear replaced curiosity, and the men realized that whatever or whoever was present, it seemed capable of not just observing but of acting in a targeted manner. The forest itself, they began to sense, had become an adversary. Inside the cabin, tension mounted as each movement, each breath felt amplified. Men whispered instructions, taking turns standing watch, guns loaded but trembling in hands unused to combat against an unknown opponent. The night stretched long, each sound magnified by silence, and each shadow a potential threat. Lantern light flickered against walls, revealing faces tightened with anxiety and uncertainty. Though the miners were accustomed to isolation, this felt different. The environment itself seemed responsive, deliberate, and aware of their presence in ways no ordinary wildlife could emulate. Some miners claimed they glimpsed figures, large ape-like silhouettes, darting between trees and rocks, moving with a combination of speed and stealth that made pursuit impossible. Others heard guttural noises, low and inhuman, carried across the canyon in bursts, sometimes coinciding with the throwing of rocks at the cabins. Whether these sounds were animal, human, or something in between remained unclear, but the combination of visual, auditory, and tactile impressions created a mounting terror. Even the most rational among them felt disoriented, uncertain whether to trust their senses or dismiss what they had seen as exhaustion and stress. When the dawn approached, the men were exhausted, voices hoarse from shouting, hands raw from clutching rifles and lanterns, and minds alert to every creak of timber or whisper of wind. The assault, whether conducted by wildlife, humans, or something the forest had conjured from shadows, receded as sunlight crept over the ridges, leaving only the echo of rocks and distant movement behind. In its wake remained questions impossible to answer: the size and number of the attackers, the coordination of their actions, and whether the night's events had truly been external, or the product of minds stretched to the limits by isolation, darkness, and fear. As night deepened over Ape Canyon, the miners realized the attack, or whatever presence haunted the forest, was not a fleeting disturbance. The first hours of tension had revealed only the edge of an ordeal that would demand every ounce of vigilance and coordination. Each man took up a position near windows or doors, rifles loaded and lanterns in hand, hearts pounding as the canyon echoed with the low, deliberate sounds that had begun hours earlier. Movement beyond the timberline suggested intention. Rocks fell in sequences that seemed to test the miners' reactions, striking near doors or windows with precision that defied random chance. The men attempted to fortify their position as best they could, dragging furniture against doors and stacking supplies to create makeshift barriers. Fires were stoked in hearths, and lanterns kept burning, their flickering light offering both comfort and a means to observe shadows. Each sound prompted a reaction. A rustle in the trees triggered a warning shout, a flash of movement set rifles trembling in anticipation. The forest, already imposing, took on an active, almost sentient presence, shaping the miners' movements as if guiding them into patterns dictated by the terrain itself. Eyewitness accounts vary, and here the historical record becomes as mysterious as the events themselves. Some miners described silhouetted figures, larger than any bear they had encountered, darting between trees and ridges, their limbs long and movements unnaturally swift. Others reported guttural screams, a mixture of human and animal sounds, coming from directions that defied simple explanation. Whether these observations described a single entity or a coordinated group remained unresolved, but the intensity of fear was unmistakable, as was the repeated impression that the forest itself was responding to the miners' every action. The miners' defensive tactics grew increasingly elaborate. One man fired into the darkness, attempting to drive back whatever assailed them, while others moved to reinforce windows and barricade vulnerable walls. Rocks hurled from unseen hands continued, sometimes striking nearby, sometimes landing yards away, reinforcing the sense of precision. The repeated impact and the combination of movement, sound, and visual anomalies suggested coordination, challenging any conventional understanding of the forest's wildlife. Every reaction seemed mirrored, every strategy tested, until exhaustion made the men question their own judgment. Historical accounts document the miners' desperate attempts to communicate or signal for assistance, though the remote location rendered outside help impossible until daylight. Their isolation intensified both the real danger and the psychological pressure. They could neither confirm nor dismiss what they experienced. Each minute stretched into an eternity, each shadow and echo magnified by fatigue and cold. Testimonies recorded later highlight that fear was not merely a response to perceived threat, but a growing certainty that the forest, through some unknown agency, had taken notice of them. Eventually the siege ebbed with the approach of morning light, but the psychological impact remained. Sleep became impossible as the men lingered in the cabins, listening for any sign that the forest would continue its assault. When dawn arrived, the external signs of attack, Rocks scattered, traces in the dirt and snow, impressions along ridgelines, offered a puzzle rather than confirmation. Investigators and historians who later examined the evidence found inconsistencies that complicated interpretation. Footprints too large for humans, rocks thrown in ways that suggested deliberate placement, and disturbances that may have been amplified by wind or shifting snow. Each detail became a point of contention, a reminder that fear and perception were intertwined, and that the forest might conceal as much as it revealed. Once daylight fully claimed the canyon, the miners' defensive efforts had survived the night, yet questions lingered. How many attackers had been present? Were they human, animal, or something entirely different? Did the forest itself, with its deceptive terrain and acoustics, play a role in shaping what the men perceived? These uncertainties, left unresolved in both contemporary accounts and later historical analysis, ensured that Ape Canyon remained a place where fear, environment, and human psychology intersected in ways that would haunt the region's lore for decades. The landscape of Ape Canyon is shaped by volcanic activity that predates the miners' arrival by millennia, a chaotic mixture of jagged lava flows, steep ridges, and narrow gullies carved by erosion and ash deposits. Trees cling to this terrain in sparse clusters on rocky outcrops and in thicker groves where soil has accumulated, creating uneven sightlines and shadowed corridors that distort perception. In the moonless nights of 1924, these features magnified every sound and movement, turning small disturbances into phenomena that seemed deliberate or threatening. Even the most experienced miners, familiar with the area, could be misled by echoes, shadow, and perspective, giving ordinary events a menacing quality. The ridges and gullies acted like natural amplifiers. Wind funneled through narrow canyons, carrying distant noises and transforming them into guttural moans or rhythmic thumps. Rocks loosened on slopes could fall in ways that mimicked the aim of an unseen hand, and shadows cast by uneven terrain could stretch into shapes far larger than the creatures that caused them. These environmental quirks made it nearly impossible to discern distance, direction, or scale, factors that became central to the miners' reports. What may have been a small animal moving among rocks could appear as a large coordinated force in the darkness. Volcanic soil and loose scree added further hazards. Even when miners attempted to track footprints or disturbances, unstable ground caused impressions to shift or collapse, erasing evidence or leaving patterns that suggested unnatural movement. Ice and frost formed in patches overnight, creating subtle changes in the terrain that obscured paths or misled observers about the weight and size of whatever crossed them. Each step in the canyon was unpredictable, and every glance into the shadow could suggest intent where none existed. The forest density contributed to the psychological pressure. Lodgepole pines and firs created corridors that channeled vision while obstructing movement, giving a sense of proximity even when threats were distant. Nighttime movement within these stands could appear sudden and coordinated, amplified by the miners' own heightened awareness. The combination of terrain, vegetation, and nighttime acoustics created a setting in which ordinary natural phenomena, such as owls, coyotes, or falling branches, could be misinterpreted as deliberate action. Historians note that these environmental factors were likely compounded by the miners' isolation and fatigue. After weeks in the canyon, muscles stiff from work and minds attuned to subtle changes in sound and movement, even small irregularities could trigger alarm. Shadows elongated unnaturally, echoes carried confusing messages, and the forest seemed to move in response to their presence. This interplay between environmental reality and human perception is central to understanding why the Ape Canyon encounter was so terrifying, and why it has persisted as a story in Pacific Northwest folklore, blurring the line between natural hazard and something far more mysterious. When word of the Ape Canyon events reached nearby towns, reactions were a mixture of disbelief, fascination, and growing unease. Local newspapers ran brief accounts, emphasizing the miners' claims of a night-long assault by something enormous and nearly human, though the articles were careful to note the lack of corroborating evidence. Residents familiar with the forest expressed skepticism, suggesting that exhaustion, wind, and unfamiliar terrain could explain the miners' reports. Yet even skeptics could not dismiss entirely the combination of footprints, displaced rocks, and the palpable fear that had gripped the men through the long night. Miners in the area recounted their experiences to visiting officials and reporters, describing large shadows, guttural noises, and rocks hurled with apparent intent. Their testimony was consistent in tone, if not in every detail, and it highlighted both the intensity of the experience and the uncertainty inherent in interpreting it. Observers struggled to reconcile the men's fear with the tangible signs they left behind, recognizing that human perception in isolation, stretched thin by fatigue, cold, and darkness, could be as compelling as any physical evidence. The story quickly became a topic of conversation throughout the region, entering local lore even as official responses remained cautious. Some loggers and hunters claimed to have encountered similar phenomena, lending anecdotal weight to the miners' account, while others dismissed the events entirely. Within months, Ape Canyon became a reference point in discussions of the unknown dangers of the Pacific Northwest forests, a place where ordinary environmental hazards and human imagination could intersect in ways that left lingering fear. Over time, historians note that the miners' report created a template for subsequent cryptid sightings in the area. The combination of isolation, unusual terrain, and human psychology had produced a story that resonated beyond the immediate incident, one that blended fact, perception, and interpretation in a way that made the forest itself seem capable of acting. Ape Canyon remained a place where the line between reality and legend was porous, a reminder that the wilderness could preserve both evidence and mystery with equal care. The Ape Canyon encounter did not fade with time. Instead, it settled into the Pacific Northwest's collective memory as both a cautionary tale and a source of enduring speculation. Researchers and historians examining the reports decades later continue to debate what the miners actually experienced. Footprints too large for known wildlife, rocks thrown with seeming precision, and guttural sounds that defied natural explanation all contributed to a narrative that straddled the line between reality and legend. Yet the forest itself did not testify, no witness beyond the whispering of trees and the uneven patterns of shadows and rocks. Over the years, the story has been cited as one of the earliest modern accounts of encounters with what later became known as Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Folklorists note that the miners' report emerged in a period when oral traditions and local legend were intertwined with practical survival knowledge, a time when isolation and extreme conditions heightened both perception and fear. The Ape Canyon incident illustrates how an environment can amplify human interpretation. A steep ridge, twisted lava flows, and dense evergreens combine to produce phenomena that may have been real, imagined, or some mixture of both. The canyon itself has remained largely unchanged, a place where hikers, loggers, and researchers can still sense the terrain's inherent difficulty and quiet menace. The narrow ridges, echoing gullies, and darkened tree lines serve as reminders that human presence in the wilderness is always temporary and fragile. For those who study the incident, the story is less about proving what occurred on that night than about understanding how isolation, environment, and human psychology intersect to create experiences that linger long after the immediate events have passed. Despite the skepticism of some observers, Ape Canyon's story continues to capture attention, inspiring books, documentaries, and debates that range from cautious historical analysis to cryptid speculation. Its persistence demonstrates how moments of unexplained fear, especially when set against a backdrop of wilderness and isolation, can embed themselves into both cultural memory and regional identity. The forest, silent and unyielding, preserves the uncertainty, leaving the question unresolved and the experience vivid in imagination. And deep within the shadows of the ridges, beneath the towering evergreens and twisted lava flows, the forest seems to hold the memory of that night, waiting for the next witness to feel its eyes upon them. The vanishing tracks near Spirit Lake. In the dense reaches of Olympic National Forest, far from the main roads and small towns that dotted the edges of Washington's western slope, a small logging crew maintained a seasonal camp in 1927. The men's days began before sunrise, the mist still clinging to the canopy as axes struck timber and saws carved through thick fir and cedar. Their cabins, roughly built and spaced along a narrow ridge, contained little beyond sleeping bunks, supply boxes, and tools essential to survival. The forest around them was a living labyrinth, dense and shadowed, offering both shelter and concealment. Every step along the moss-covered ground or fallen log demanded care, for the terrain was uneven and rivers and creeks carved hidden ravines that could swallow a man unaware. Life at the camp was defined by rhythm and routine. Meals were communal, firewood had to be split and stacked, and equipment was maintained to prevent costly accidents. The men were used to isolation and silence, accustomed to the occasional rustle of wildlife, the wind through high branches, and the distant roar of rivers descending from the mountains. Despite the remoteness, there was a sense of familiarity. Each man knew the position of cabins, the trails to the logging sites, and the subtle markers that indicated safe paths through thick undergrowth. This knowledge lent them a confidence that outsiders could rarely understand, a confidence that the forest would not on its own turn against them. Yet the forest was indifferent to human schedules and routines. Streams swelled without warning after rain, fallen branches obscured paths overnight, and the fog that crept along the ridge could erase landmarks in minutes. For decades, loggers and trappers had learned to read the forest's quiet signals, adjusting routines and maintaining constant vigilance. The crew at this camp operated under the same principles, relying on both skill and observation to navigate a landscape that was unforgiving to error. Even within this structure of labour and observation, small anomalies could unsettle men used to isolation. A snapped tree limb in an unusual location, the absence of familiar bird calls, or a sudden chill could shift attention from work to instinctive caution. In this camp, where visibility often ended at a few dozen yards, and the forest pressed in from every side, such details mattered. The stage was set not with immediate threat, but with subtle tension, a quiet suggestion that the wilderness around them could conceal more than just shadows, and that disappearance rather than confrontation might one day redefine the rules of survival in this vast, unyielding forest. In the weeks leading up to the timber crew's disappearance, the men began noticing subtle disturbances that, at first, seemed inconsequential. Tools left outside cabins were sometimes missing or misplaced, only to reappear in locations that made no sense. Cords and ropes used to haul logs were occasionally frayed, as if snagged by an unseen force, and small bundles of supplies would vanish for hours before being found scattered along trails. These occurrences were never violent or destructive, yet in a forest as dense and isolated as Olympic National Forest, the repetition bred unease. The men attempted to rationalize these anomalies, citing the unpredictable behavior of local wildlife. Bears, cougars, and raccoons were known to raid camps, and smaller creatures like foxes or martens could easily disturb supplies. Yet nothing in the pattern of these incidents fully aligned with known animal behavior. Footprints, large, irregular, and unlike any familiar fauna, were discovered near cabins and along logging paths, often disappearing into dense undergrowth where no human could follow. At night, the forest seemed to respond to their presence in subtle ways. Branches snapped with no discernible cause, distant hollows echoed sounds that could not be traced, and a sudden silence would fall over areas usually alive with birds, insects, and wind. Communication with nearby settlements offered little reassurance. Supply runners arrived on schedule, but the logs of their travels occasionally contained notes of broken trails, confusing landmarks, and unusual weather patterns that complicated navigation. Radio communication was minimal and unreliable, meaning that by the time any anomalies were reported, days could have passed in which the forest had erased or obscured evidence. The combination of isolation, dense canopy, and difficult terrain created a situation in which normal vigilance felt insufficient, and in which the absence of explanation became as alarming as any direct threat. The miners began cataloguing these anomalies, noting times, locations, and conditions with methodical care. They recognized that the forest was not intentionally hostile, but also understood that human perception, already stretched thin by isolation and fatigue, could exaggerate the ordinary into the extraordinary. Yet the accumulation of these signs, disappearing tools, strange tracks, unexplained sounds, began to produce an atmosphere of tension that altered daily routines. Walks along the logging paths were no longer casual. Men moved in pairs, scanning shadows and checking for evidence of disturbance at every step. By midweek, the pattern had grown more pronounced. Even during daylight, the forest seemed to harbour secrets. Logs freshly cut for the sawmill were found slightly shifted, some supplies appeared to have been moved deliberately, and the air itself seemed heavier in certain areas, as if the forest had grown denser overnight. The crew began to feel that the environment was no longer merely a backdrop but an active participant, hiding something that watched, waited, and perhaps planned. It was against this growing tension and accumulating evidence of small anomalies that the timber crew would vanish, leaving only an empty camp and a forest that preserved its silence with absolute fidelity. The first inkling that something had gone wrong came not from the forest itself, but from the schedules the timber crew had meticulously maintained. Supply deliveries were missed, daily check-ins went unanswered, and the logging company's expected production reports failed to arrive. At first, these lapses were attributed to weather, fatigue, or minor delays, but as hours stretched into days, concern grew into alarm. The forest surrounding the camp, dense and labyrinthine, already concealed much, leaving only the quiet, creeping dread that the men's absence could signal something far more serious than a simple delay. Search parties were organised, but the forest immediately asserted its dominance over the investigation. Thick underbrush, fallen logs, and steep ravines slowed even the most experienced searchers. Fog clung to the canopy, reducing visibility to a few dozen feet, and narrow creeks and swollen streams forced detours that added hours to the search. Snow patches in higher elevations hid footprints, and soft moss absorbed impressions, leaving investigators with traces that were incomplete and often misleading. The very environment that had sustained the crew in isolation now seemed to conspire with their disappearance, turning ordinary terrain into a puzzle of shadows, echoes, and false leads. When searchers finally reached the camp, the scene offered no immediate answers. Cabins stood undisturbed, doors were closed, stoves cold, and supplies arranged with an almost eerie order. There was no evidence of struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood, nothing to suggest a hasty departure under duress. Yet the crew was gone, vanished without a trace. Personal items, a pair of boots, a hat, a lone tool chest, were discovered scattered along faint trails, their positions inconsistent and inexplicable. Each fragment of evidence created more questions than it answered, as if the forest itself had intentionally shaped the scene to confuse anyone trying to reconstruct it. Observers noted small but unsettling anomalies. Tracks found near the cabins were often too large, too irregular or distorted, disappearing into dense undergrowth or shallow water where no human could follow. Tree branches were bent at unnatural angles, impressions in the soil suggested movement against the natural slope, and small disturbances in the underbrush hinted at passage but offered no clear direction. Witness accounts from neighbouring settlements added to the complexity. Supply runners reported vague movements along ridges, distant cries that could not be attributed to animals, and fleeting shadows glimpsed between trees. Some descriptions were contradictory, while others were nearly identical, suggesting that perception, and perhaps imagination, played as significant a role as physical evidence. The timeline of disappearance became a tangle of overlapping observations. The last confirmed sighting of the men at the camp, the delayed communications, the first reports of unusual activity from neighbours, and subsequent evidence found by searchers created a patchwork chronology. Gaps in this timeline stretched from hours to days, with each missing segment magnifying uncertainty. Search parties pressed further into the forest, but the terrain, steep, uneven, and heavily vegetated, erased traces as quickly as they were discovered. Every footstep, every displaced branch, every faint echo of sound became a potential clue and a potential illusion. With search parties moving through ridges, gullies, and river crossings, it became painfully clear that absence itself was the most telling evidence. The forest had concealed the crew while leaving fragments that hinted at movement, but each trace seemed deliberately misleading. Tracks ended abruptly, personal items were scattered inconsistently, and impressions in the soil suggested passage that could not be verified. Investigators reconstructed likely routes, marking the paths the men may have taken, yet each reconstruction raised more questions than it answered. Witness reports, sparse and often contradictory, are layered atop these physical traces, adding to the uncertainty rather than resolving it. In every corner of the camp and along each trail, the forest seemed to guard its secrets carefully, leaving searchers to piece together a story that the terrain itself seemed determined to obscure. As searchers moved through the dense canopy surrounding the abandoned logging camp, they encountered evidence that was both intriguing and maddeningly inconsistent. Footprints appeared across moss-covered slopes and muddy trails, yet none followed a predictable pattern. Some impressions were deep, irregular, and far larger than any boot known to the area, while others were shallow, regular, and human-like, only to vanish abruptly into undergrowth, boulders, or the edge of swift streams. Each fragment suggested presence but refused confirmation, leaving investigators to question whether the traces reflected hurried flight, deliberate misdirection, or natural distortion caused by terrain and weather. Scattered objects added further ambiguity. A hat lay caught between rocks as if dropped mid-step. A tool chest rested along a trail, partially concealed by fallen branches. Clothing fragments appeared in multiple locations, sometimes far from any visible path. None of these items fit a simple narrative. Were they evidence of escape or struggle? Had wildlife redistributed them? Or had soil, moss, and erosion created the illusion of movement? Every discovery seemed to contradict the last, producing a complex puzzle that refused resolution. Witness statements compounded the challenge. Neighbours reported seeing figures moving near the camp at odd hours, sometimes along ridges, other times through gullies. Some described hearing voices calling names or the rhythmic tapping of axes long after dawn, while others recalled nothing unusual. These accounts conflicted in timing, direction, and detail, yet shared a consistent undertone of unease. Investigators quickly realized that human perception, already strained by isolation, fatigue, and fear, was as unreliable as the forest itself. Environmental factors further muddled the interpretation. Fog distorted distances, shadows stretched unpredictably, and the dense canopy muffled sounds, making ordinary noises appear deliberate. Streams carried away footprints overnight, and fallen branches or shifting moss obscured trails. Every step taken by searchers required meticulous observation, yet the forest continued to conceal and confound, leaving each trace open to multiple explanations. Despite painstaking documentation of footprints, items, and sightings, investigators could not reconcile the contradictions. Measurements of step length, depth, or direction produced conflicting reconstructions of the crew's movements. Some tracks suggested multiple people, others appeared solitary, leading to dead ends or vanishing entirely. The evidence painted a fragmented, confusing picture, with no single interpretation gaining consensus. Search parties retraced paths repeatedly, often discovering that footprints had shifted, items moved by wind or water, or trails erased. The forest resisted clear understanding, and every new anomaly added to the tension rather than clarifying the events. Investigators found themselves navigating a landscape in which both perception and evidence were unreliable, forced to piece together a story that seemed to shift with every step. Even with methodical observation, the forest remained unpredictable. Searchers followed impressions and examined abandoned items, but each sweep revealed further anomalies, compelling them to question whether any clue truly represented the crew's movements. The complexity of evidence, combined with conflicting reports, ensured that the investigation would remain a test of patience, judgment, and endurance as the forest continued to conceal more than it revealed. The forest itself proved to be an obstacle that no human planning could fully overcome. Olympic National Forest, with its dense stands of fir, cedar, and hemlock, created a labyrinth of shadows and hidden gullies that slowed even the most experienced searchers. Steep ridges twisted into unseen valleys, while fallen trees and thick undergrowth forced teams to detour repeatedly, leaving tracks that could not be traced and erasing evidence of every step. Streams swollen with rain obscured footprints and carried debris far downstream, while soft moss absorbed impressions that would have otherwise guided investigators toward the missing men. Every attempt to establish patterns or follow traces was complicated by terrain that refused predictability. The weather further hampered efforts. Persistent fog reduced visibility to a few dozen feet, while intermittent rainfall softened the soil, smearing footprints and washing away lighter objects. Cold snaps in higher elevations left thin layers of snow that concealed both footprints and scattered items, only to melt quickly and erase the last evidence. Even in daylight, light filtered through dense canopies and shifting patterns, turning ordinary shadows into shapes that appeared to move with intention. For searchers, every sensory impression was suspect. Sounds could be wildlife or wind, shapes in the distance might be animals, fellow investigators, or simply the forest playing tricks on the mind. The remoteness of the camp also strained logistics. Supply lines were long, communication was limited, and teams often had to rely on rudimentary maps of trails that were partially overgrown or non-existent. Investigators spent hours navigating ridges and creek crossings that a crew familiar with the terrain would have known instinctively. This gap between human preparation and the forest's complexity created delays that compounded uncertainty. By the time searchers reached certain areas, evidence had already been disturbed by natural processes or obscured by the environment. Even physical evidence behaved unpredictably. A fallen branch might resemble a displaced item, a small rock slide could mask a footprint, a partially submerged tool could drift downstream unnoticed. The combination of dense vegetation, variable lighting, uneven terrain, and environmental forces meant that every trace required careful, repeated examination. Investigators could document, measure, and catalogue, yet they were never fully confident that what they saw represented reality, rather than the forest's quiet manipulation of appearances. In this way, the terrain itself became an uncooperative witness, offering hints that were incomplete, inconsistent, or misleading. The environment dictated both what could be discovered and how investigators interpreted each finding, leaving the forest as much a participant in the mystery as the missing crew. Every ridge, creek, and thicket contributed to the uncertainty, reinforcing the sense that the forest was guarding its secrets as carefully as it had concealed the timber crew from sight. In the wake of the timber crew's disappearance, speculation arose almost immediately, fueled by the contradictions in evidence and the forest's impenetrable nature. Early theories focused on accidents, slips along moss-covered ridges, falls into hidden gullies, or drowning in rapidly rising creeks. These explanations were grounded in the environment. The terrain was steep, wet, and unpredictable, and even experienced loggers could be overwhelmed by its hidden hazards. Yet no bodies or definitive traces were found in areas where accidents seemed most plausible, leaving investigators uneasy about simple explanations. Some suggested that wildlife might have played a larger role than initially assumed. Bears and cougars were known to roam the forest extensively, capable of scavenging and disturbing trails, while smaller animals could redistribute clothing or tools. Yet these possibilities struggled to account for the scale and pattern of evidence. Items appeared scattered in ways inconsistent with animal behaviour, and large, deep footprints suggested human presence rather than fauna. Even experienced trappers and loggers admitted that while wildlife could complicate an investigation, it rarely produced the level of ambiguity seen in this case. A few accounts ventured into speculation beyond the natural world. Stories circulated of shadowy figures glimpsed moving through foggy ridges, of noises echoing through valleys that did not match known wildlife, and of tracks that defied conventional measurement. While these reports were never corroborated, they were documented in company logs and witness statements, forming a pattern of ambiguity that has persisted in historical retellings. Historians note that such narratives often emerge in isolated environments, where prolonged isolation, uncertainty, and the pressure of missing colleagues heighten perception and memory, blending fear with observation. Documented investigations also considered human involvement. The crew was small, and the logging area remote, reducing the likelihood of outside interference. Yet supply conflicts, rival crews in the region, and the occasional disputes over timber rights were recorded in historical logs, suggesting that at least a minimal human factor could not be entirely ruled out. No suspects were ever identified, and the evidence provided no clear motive or opportunity, leaving authorities to focus primarily on environmental causes and the fragmentary traces left behind. Despite decades of review, the case remains unresolved, its ambiguity preserved by the forest itself. Each reconstruction, every theory, encounters the same challenge. The dense canopy, hidden gullies, shifting weather, and scattered evidence resist certainty. The timber crew vanished without a trace that could definitively explain what befell them, and the forest continues to hold its secrets in ways that have shaped both speculation and historical interpretation for generations. Many years on, the disappearance of the timber crew continues to provoke questions that remain unanswered. Every footprint, abandoned tool, and fragment of clothing is catalogued in historical records, yet none provide clarity beyond their immediate context. Searchers and investigators alike were forced to acknowledge a fundamental truth. The forest neither explains nor justifies, it simply preserves. Ridges, gullies, and streams act as both witness and concealment, recording events in ways humans cannot fully decipher. The patterns of movement, the placement of items, and the contradictory reports all point to activity that is undeniable, yet the story behind it remains elusive. Historians and forensic analysts have revisited the evidence repeatedly, comparing environmental conditions, documented witness accounts, and the crew's known habits. The remote location, combined with unpredictable weather and dense undergrowth, has consistently emerged as a primary factor. Yet even when accounting for these natural obstacles, inconsistencies remain. Footprints suggest hurried movement in one area, while personal items indicate deliberate placement in another. Reports of sounds and fleeting shadows add a psychological layer to the physical mystery, making it difficult to separate perception from reality. The human element, the crew's familiarity with the terrain, their routines, and their ability to navigate the forest, complicates speculation further. Experienced loggers would have known which paths were safest, how to avoid hazards, and where to shelter during sudden storms. Their disappearance despite these skills highlights a persistent uncertainty. Either something beyond ordinary accidents intervened, or the forest itself altered the conditions enough to render expertise insufficient. Every reconstruction, no matter how methodical, is shadowed by the forest's ability to obscure evidence and manipulate perception. Local communities still recount the story with a mixture of caution and awe. Supply runners and forest neighbours speak of the abandoned camp with a quiet reverence, noting the traces left behind and the unanswered questions that linger. The ambiguity has become part of the forest's identity, an invisible boundary separating known events from conjecture, leaving anyone who enters the area aware of its unpredictability and the silent testimony of its hidden corridors. For investigators, historians, and those drawn to unexplained disappearances, the timber crew's fate remains suspended between record and conjecture, each clue offering a suggestion rather than an answer. And in the heart of Olympic National Forest, the forest itself keeps watch, preserving the story with an indifference that no human inquiry has yet overcome. The trail ends not with discovery, but with the echo of absence that still waits among the trees. The bottomless pit that wasn't supposed to exist, the Mel's Hole broadcast. Few stories in the annals of unexplained phenomena have captured public attention like Mel's Hole, a pit so deep it allegedly resisted all attempts at measurement. Its discovery, as recounted by Mel Waters, a longtime resident of rural Washington, was unremarkable in appearance but extraordinary in consequence. Waters described the chasm as a vertical gash in the earth, its walls smooth in some places, jagged in others, lined with earth and roots that seemed to vanish into darkness. Objects dropped into the pit did not simply fall, they disappeared, producing sounds or vibrations that suggested impossible depth. Even in recounting these events, Waters maintained a careful, almost clinical tone, but listeners could sense that the hole was more than a simple geological curiosity. According to his account, small rocks fell silently for minutes before any sound registered at the surface, and tools sent into the void produced noises that implied descent for hundreds of feet, far beyond what local geography would allow. Waters also reported that the air near the rim carried subtle vibrations and chills, as if the pit itself were breathing. Animals, he claimed, avoided the edges entirely. Birds would circle above but never land. Such observations, mundane and eerie at once, lent his story a credibility that captured attention beyond casual rumour. Neighbours and local officials were sceptical at first. Some dismissed Waters' accounts as embellishment, a colourful addition to the region's folklore of strange forests, hidden caves, and unexplained phenomena. Others, however, remembered oddities in the area: livestock found wandering unusually near the pit, a faint echo that carried in the valleys at odd hours, or vegetation along the rim that appeared unnaturally stunted or twisted. Each observation added layers of unease to an already puzzling feature, suggesting that if the pit's depth was extraordinary, so too were the forces that seemed to surround it. Word of the pit spread quietly through conversations at supply stores, community gatherings, and personal journals. People travelling near Ellensburg began reporting subtle anomalies, distant sounds with no source, impressions of movement at the edge of perception, and fleeting glimpses of shadow where none should exist. The hole became not only a physical mystery, but a psychological one, pressing on those who approached it with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and fascination. As the story circulated beyond its immediate vicinity, it drew the attention of those intrigued by anomalies and the unexplained. The pit remained unmeasured and unverified, yet its reputation had already taken hold, presenting a single persistent question: what truly lay at the bottom of Mel's Hole, and could anyone ever know? The story of Mel's Hole might have remained a quiet regional curiosity if not for the night it was shared on national airwaves. On a late evening in 1997, Mel Waters appeared on Coast to Coast AM, the nationally syndicated paranormal radio show hosted by Art Bell, a program renowned for exploring the unexplained. Millions of listeners tuned in across the country, drawn to the promise of unusual phenomena. Bell's audience was already accustomed to tales of UFOs, cryptids, and strange occurrences, yet the depth and peculiar nature of Mel's pit distinguished it from other reports. During the broadcast, Waters described the hole with careful specificity, emphasizing its vertical walls, impossible depth, and the mysterious behavior of objects dropped into the void. He spoke of chains that never reached the bottom, rocks that fell silently for minutes, and animals that vanished entirely without sound. The narrative he offered was meticulous yet haunting, blending the observable with the inexplicable. Each description was punctuated by pauses, giving listeners the impression of a man struggling to convey a phenomenon that defied normal comprehension. Listeners were quick to react, some with fascination, others with disbelief. Callers flooded the station with questions, speculation, and their own anecdotes, and the story rapidly became a conversation across forums, offices, and homes. Many were drawn to the broadcast because it offered more than just a local legend. It provided an account from a first-hand witness, delivered in real time, that challenged both common sense and skepticism. The hole became a locus of intrigue not only for paranormal enthusiasts but for anyone captivated by the idea of a place in the world that remained wholly unmeasured. Media attention followed cautiously, with newspapers and magazines covering the broadcast and recounting Waters' claims, though often with a tone of skepticism. Some reporters attempted to investigate, visiting the general area, speaking with neighbours, and documenting anecdotal observations. These attempts rarely produced definitive evidence. The pit was difficult to access, and Waters remained protective of the exact location. Inconsistent reports and the impossibility of measuring the depth only added to the growing aura of mystery. The broadcast also introduced a psychological dimension. Listeners described an almost tangible unease while hearing the story, as though the pit itself extended beyond the airwaves, casting a shadow over imagination and perception. Overnight, Mel's Hole became a phenomenon of both media and folklore, a story that existed simultaneously in reality, in testimony, and in the minds of those who imagined its unmeasured depths. The interplay of voice, description, and uncertainty made the tale more compelling and more unnerving than any visual evidence could have. At the conclusion of the broadcast, the pit had transcended its local origins. It became a symbol of the unexplained, an invitation to wonder, and a source of unease. The hole's true nature remained concealed, yet its presence was firmly established in the public imagination. And for those who listened that night, the question persisted, silent but insistent. How deep did Mel's Hole truly go, and what lay hidden in its shadowed depths? Beyond the broadcast, curiosity drew attention back to the region itself, and with it came a series of local testimonies that only deepened the mystery of Mel's Hole. Neighbours, loggers, and occasional travellers recounted unusual occurrences in the area surrounding the pit, though none could confirm its precise location. Some claimed to have seen unusual vegetation patterns along steep banks, noting that certain trees seemed unnaturally stunted while underbrush formed curious clearings. Others described an odd stillness in the air near the edge of the supposed pit, a silence so profound that even birds and insects seemed absent, lending the land a weighty, almost unnatural quiet. Several accounts suggested the pit affected wildlife in inexplicable ways. Dogs would reportedly refuse to approach certain slopes, and livestock strayed in strange patterns, avoiding areas near the chasm. Observers noted that small animals seemed to vanish unexpectedly, though no evidence of predation was ever found. Birds were seen circling overhead but never alighted, and at times the air carried a faint vibration, almost a low hum that unsettled those standing nearby. Each story, fragmentary and anecdotal, reinforced the sense that something unusual existed beyond ordinary perception. Eyewitnesses who attempted to approach the pit reported strange physical sensations. Some spoke of a sudden chill even on warm days, others described an uneasy pressure on their ears, as if sound itself behaved differently near the edge. Shadows seemed to move independently of the sun's angle, and glimpses of the pit's interior were described as impossible to interpret. Darkness that seemed to stretch beyond reason, walls that disappeared into a void rather than sloping downward. Even those skeptical of paranormal explanations admitted a creeping unease when recounting the experience. Accounts were often inconsistent, contradictory, or incomplete, complicating any attempt at verification. Some witnesses placed the pit near streams, others atop gentle hills. Some reported visible debris at the edge, while others claimed the rim was entirely smooth. Such variations, whether the result of memory, perception, or deliberate secrecy, contributed to a growing sense that the pit was a feature both tangible and elusive, tangible enough to provoke sensation, but elusive enough to evade measurement. Local folklore began to intertwine with these first-hand accounts. Rumours suggested government involvement, secret experiments, or subterranean phenomena beyond normal understanding. Others simply treated the pit as an unexplained oddity, a mystery in the landscape to be respected and avoided. Regardless of interpretation, a pattern emerged. The more people engaged with the pit, whether by hearing of it or venturing near, the more their descriptions emphasized the unexplainable, reinforcing the idea that Mel's Hole resisted ordinary perception and challenged conventional logic. Even without photographic evidence or precise measurements, the accumulation of local testimonies created a sense of authenticity, of a place whose strangeness was experienced rather than proven. Each anecdote built upon the last, forming a mosaic of uncertainty in which the pit's reality remained unquestioned, yet its nature remained indecipherable. And as these accounts circulated, they set the stage for attempts to measure, explore, and explain a hole that refused to conform to any known understanding. Investigators and curious onlookers quickly discovered that approaching Mel's Hole required more than simply knowing the way. The terrain was unyielding. Slopes dropped sharply into thick undergrowth, loose soil shifted underfoot, and hidden gullies threatened sudden missteps. Even those familiar with the area had to navigate with extreme caution, often pausing to clear brush or find a stable footing before drawing near the rim. Every movement felt tentative, as though the land itself was conspiring to obscure what lay within the pit. Attempts to measure the hole produced results that deepened the sense of unease. Weighted ropes and chains were lowered, yet none reached a definitive bottom. Rocks fell, with sounds and delays that suggested impossible depths, while sometimes striking points on unseen ledges, creating echoes that contradicted previous measurements. Early electronic sensors, rudimentary by modern standards, offered no clarity, producing readings that varied drastically depending on weather, angle, or placement. Each method, however precise in theory, seemed inadequate when confronted with the pit's resistance to human understanding. Environmental conditions compounded these difficulties. Mist often rose from surrounding valleys, reducing visibility to only a few feet and giving the forest a disorienting, ghostly quality. Shifting sunlight through the canopy created deceptive shadows, making distances appear greater or smaller than they were. Even the air near the pit seemed altered. Some observers reported a subtle pressure on the chest, a low, almost imperceptible hum, or sudden cold that did not correspond to ambient temperature. These sensations, fleeting yet persistent, added an immeasurable element to the investigation, blurring the line between observation and perception. Investigators' notes frequently documented minor mishaps: ropes snagging on unseen roots, small rocks deflecting unexpectedly, and objects that failed to return predictably. These incidents, recorded meticulously, highlighted the forest's role not as a passive backdrop, but as an active, unpredictable participant in the investigation. Footsteps crunched unevenly over leaf litter, echoes ricocheted strangely, and the pit seemed to amplify both sound and silence, challenging conventional methods of recording and comprehension. Psychological strain became apparent in nearly every attempt. Observers reported dizziness, vertigo, or a creeping unease as they peered into the darkness, their sense of scale and time distorted by the vertical abyss. Some found themselves compelled to step back repeatedly, as though the void exerted an unspoken influence. The repeated failure to reconcile measurements, combined with the forest's indifferent complexity, underscored the challenge of imposing human logic onto a phenomenon that seemed designed to evade it entirely. While instruments were lowered, readings logged, and sketches drawn, Mel's Hole continued to defy understanding. Its presence was undeniable, yet every approach produced more questions than answers, leaving investigators suspended between observation and speculation, aware that their attempts were only revealing fragments of an unfathomable reality. With physical exploration producing contradictory and inconclusive results, the focus inevitably shifted to interpretation. Theories surrounding Mel's Hole ranged from the mundane to the extraordinary, reflecting both the pit's elusiveness and the human need to make sense of what could not be measured. Geologists proposed explanations rooted in natural formations, suggesting it might be a collapsed mineshaft or a rare karst sinkhole. These hypotheses attempted to frame the pit within known geological processes, but none fully accounted for the peculiar behaviours reported by observers, objects disappearing for minutes before audible impact, vibrations carried through the rim, and the localised effects on air, temperature and sound. Paranormal enthusiasts and radio listeners, influenced by the Art Bell broadcast, offered far less conventional explanations. Some suggested the hole was a dimensional anomaly, a portal or gateway to a space beyond ordinary perception. Others speculated about government involvement, imagining secret experiments or containment measures that rendered the pit impervious to measurement. Each speculation, while unverified, contributed to the growing mystique of the site, reinforcing its identity as a feature that resisted categorization and challenged ordinary logic. Even within rational circles, psychological and environmental factors became part of the discussion. Observers' perceptions could be influenced by fatigue, uneven terrain, and the inherent eeriness of the isolated landscape. Echoes, shadows, and subtle vibrations could easily exaggerate or distort sensory input. Yet even with this in mind, the consistency of certain reports, animals avoiding the area, objects behaving unpredictably, and the forest's uncanny quiet, hinted at something more than simple misperception. The pit seemed to occupy a space at the intersection of reality and the inexplicable, where the ordinary rules of observation were incomplete. Media and internet communities further complicated the discourse. Online forums, UFO and paranormal discussion boards, and radio follow-ups transformed local accounts into a broader phenomenon, blending fact, rumour, and interpretation. The hole became as much a story told in collective imagination as a feature of the landscape. Discussions ranged from detailed analyses of the broadcast and early photographs to speculative debates about the pit's possible depth, environmental anomalies, or metaphysical significance. The proliferation of perspectives ensured that the mystery was never static, continuously reshaped by new narrations and interpretations. Amid these conflicting theories, one constant remained. No single explanation could satisfy both observation and experience. The pit resisted every attempt at simplification, leaving a spectrum of possibilities rather than a definitive answer. It became clear that any attempt to fully rationalise Mel's Hole risked ignoring the peculiarities that made it compelling: the unpredictable object behaviour, the subtle environmental effects, and the profound unease it inspired in those who approached. Speculation, however, did more than offer answers. It shaped how the pit was perceived, influencing the way people approached it, discussed it, and imagined it. Each retelling, whether by radio hosts, forum commentators, or casual observers, added new layers of interpretation, intertwining personal experience with broader myth-making. The narrative of Mel's Hole began to occupy a space that was part reality, part perception, and part folklore, ensuring that every exploration or account carried the weight of both observation and imagination. As Mel's Hole entered the wider public imagination, it became more than a local curiosity. It evolved into a symbol of mystery, drawing attention from writers, radio audiences, and online communities. Stories circulated in books, magazines, and websites, often embellishing the original account while preserving its core strangeness. The pit transcended its physical existence, becoming a cultural artifact in which the boundary between fact and folklore was deliberately blurred. Each retelling, whether from a first-hand witness or a second-hand report, contributed to a growing mythology that made the pit feel simultaneously tangible and inaccessible. Tourists and amateur investigators began to seek the region, motivated by both skepticism and fascination. They often approached with caution, guided more by curiosity than concrete directions, and frequently returned with anecdotes of strange sensations, unusual echoes, or fleeting glimpses of the rim shrouded in mist. In some cases, these encounters reinforced the pit's legendary status, while in others, the difficulty of locating the site added to the narrative that it was elusive by design. The forest surrounding the alleged pit became part of the legend, its isolation and unpredictable terrain acting as both protector and amplifier of the mystery. Media portrayal intensified the phenomenon. Radio shows, podcasts and documentaries highlighted Waters' account and subsequent investigations, often emphasizing the pit's immeasurable depth and the eerie environmental effects reported by observers. Journalists and content creators occasionally attempted to verify details, but conflicting reports and the protective secrecy of the land made comprehensive coverage impossible. Each broadcast or article, whether skeptical or credulous, contributed to a public perception in which Mel's Hole existed as much in imagination as in reality, an anomaly whose reputation was shaped as much by narrative as by observation. Online communities played a particularly pivotal role. Forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena dissected the broadcast, compared local accounts, and speculated on possible explanations ranging from geological oddities to interdimensional portals. These discussions often amplified minor inconsistencies, creating a layered collaborative folklore. Even individuals who had never visited the site felt intimately acquainted with it through photographs, diagrams, and repeated retellings, highlighting how narrative can transform a remote location into a collective cultural touchstone. Folklore surrounding the pit is intertwined with the landscape itself. Locals spoke cautiously of its existence, weaving cautionary tales about approaching the rim, while stories of vanished objects and strange sounds circulated as warnings or curiosities. The legend was carefully sustained by the combination of eyewitness reports, media attention, and human imagination, producing a cultural resonance that extended far beyond the immediate area. Mel's Hole had become a narrative space where reality, perception, and myth coexisted, and where every new account added depth to a story that remained unresolved. Years after the initial broadcast, curiosity about Mel's Hole drew renewed attention from both amateur investigators and journalists. Small teams ventured into the rugged terrain of central Washington, often relying on fragmentary directions, local recollections, and topographic maps that offered little guidance. The forest itself seemed to resist approach. Dense underbrush snagged boots and clothing, loose soil shifted unexpectedly, and hidden gullies concealed steep drops. Observers frequently reported a disorienting sense of scale, where slopes appeared either impossibly deep or deceptively shallow, and echoes from distant objects often contradicted expectations, creating the impression that the land itself was warping perception. Modern technology provided new tools but introduced fresh complications. Ground-penetrating radar, digital depth sensors, and even thermal imaging were deployed, yet dense vegetation, rocky soil, and subtle magnetic anomalies disrupted readings. Drones offered elevated views, revealing depressions and subtle changes in topography, but none definitively pinpointed a vertical chasm matching Waters' description. Laser rangefinders occasionally produced conflicting measurements, and objects lowered into potential depressions sometimes bounced, snagged, or produced echoes inconsistent with previous trials. Each attempt appeared to confirm the pit's resistance to conventional observation, reinforcing its reputation as elusive and enigmatic. Eyewitness reports continued to surface. Hikers, hunters, and surveyors described sudden chills, low-frequency vibrations beneath their feet, and an almost imperceptible pull when near depressions that could mark the rim. Wildlife behaved strangely. Dogs refused to approach certain areas, deer skirted the slopes, and birds avoided landing nearby. Observers recounted rocks or small tools behaving unpredictably, disappearing momentarily before returning with unexpected sounds. Some investigators felt compelled to withdraw repeatedly, reporting vertigo, dizziness, or a creeping unease as they stared into darkness that seemed to extend beyond comprehension. Journalists revisiting the story noted that Mel Waters himself remained elusive about the pit's exact location. At times, he offered directions that varied slightly from previous accounts, emphasizing hazards and the difficulty of the terrain. Skeptics suggested deliberate obfuscation, while others argued that private land, dense forest, and the natural hazards of steep slopes made precise identification inherently difficult. Locals echoed this cautious approach, speaking of the pit in measured tones and passing down warnings about environmental hazards and the unsettling qualities of the site. Comparisons between early investigations in the 1990s and modern follow-ups reveal both continuity and evolution in the narrative. Technology allowed more systematic attempts at measurement, yet the results remained inconsistent. The psychological effects on observers, disorientation, fascination, subtle vertigo, persisted, suggesting that the pit's influence was as much experiential as it was physical. Minor missteps, unusual echoes, and environmental interference all contributed to the sense that Mel's Hole could not be fully understood or documented, leaving every investigator to reconcile observable phenomena with the limitations of perception and measurement. Time has done little to clarify. The pit continues to resist precise identification. Objects behave unpredictably, terrain confounds measurement, and those who approach often find themselves unsettled in ways that cannot be quantified, ensuring that the story of Mel's Hole remains active, unresolved, and compelling for anyone who dares to explore its shadowed edges. No one has ever reached the bottom of Mel's Hole, and some who stood at the rim swear the darkness seemed to stare back. The Forgotten Bigfoot Trap of Rogue River Siskiyou. The Rogue River Siskiyou region stretches across the borderlands of southwestern Oregon and northern California, a landscape defined by jagged ridges, dense coniferous forests, and rivers that carve deep valleys into the mountains. Even on maps, much of the terrain appears as unbroken green, a tangle of Douglas fir, cedar, and tonoke where sunlight rarely reaches the forest floor. The isolation is striking. Few roads penetrate the area, and trails that do exist often vanish into moss-covered slopes and thick underbrush. For generations, local hunters, trappers, and forest workers have described the wilderness as both beautiful and unforgiving, a place where the familiar rules of navigation and perception sometimes fail. Within this isolation, stories of strange sightings have long circulated. Settlers of the 19th century recalled odd footprints near riverbanks, large shapes glimpsed between the trees, and guttural calls echoing in the night. Indigenous oral histories, passed down through tribes such as the Takelma and Shasta, contain references to towering forest dwellers and mysterious creatures that moved silently through the timber. These accounts were rarely documented formally, but in combination with settler anecdotes, they created a persistent sense that the forest was home to more than deer, elk, and the occasional bear. Locals described the woods as having a kind of consciousness, an indifference that felt almost aware when humans entered its deeper recesses. It was this reputation that made the Rogue River Siskiyou forests a site of interest for early cryptid hunters and Bigfoot enthusiasts. Sparse access, coupled with reports of unusually large tracks and animal disturbances, suggested a potential hotspot for encounters. Hunters who frequented the area often spoke of being watched, of broken branches in patterns that could not be attributed to ordinary wildlife, and of how quickly the forest could erase human traces, leaving no trail of passage. The combination of natural challenge and folklore elevated the region to a near mythic status among those who sought the extraordinary amid the ordinary wilderness. The story of the Bigfoot trap itself originates from this cultural backdrop. Constructed decades ago in a remote gulch, the trap was intended, according to legend, as a method of capturing or observing an unknown creature. Even today, the location is described as treacherous. Steep ravines, rock slides, and dense vegetation make access difficult, ensuring that only the most determined or reckless individuals could reach it. Over time, stories of the trap have mingled with the forest's own reputation, so that the structure is not merely a piece of abandoned wood or rope, but a symbol of human ambition confronting the untamed wilderness. In this way, the Rogue River Siskiyou forests serve not just as a setting, but as a character in their own right. The terrain shapes the narrative, influencing perception, heightening tension, and dictating the terms under which any investigation then or now can take place. The trap's history cannot be separated from the surrounding wilderness. It exists within a web of isolation, natural danger, and stories that blur the line between fact and folklore, drawing those who seek it into a forest that remains indifferent to their intentions. The first documented discovery of the trap in the Rogue River Siskiyou forests came not from a dedicated expedition but from a chance encounter. A forest ranger, patrolling a seldom-used trail in the late 1970s, noticed an unusual arrangement of wooden stakes and crude supports along a narrow gulch. At first, the structures seemed like remnants of an old hunting or trapping operation, but the sheer scale and design suggested a deliberate effort to capture something far larger than ordinary wildlife. The ranger's notes describe beams partially camouflaged by moss, rope fraying with age, and a depression in the earth that hinted at repeated use or pressure. Closer inspection revealed subtle signs that the trap had been active. Large footprints, much wider than any known local animal, were pressed into the mud around the structure. Broken branches and flattened undergrowth formed unnatural paths leading to the pit, and scattered remnants of bait ranging from meat scraps to tree sap hinted at careful preparation. The forest, even in its apparent stillness, seemed to retain the memory of movement, disturbances in soil and foliage that suggested something had passed through repeatedly, yet left only traces that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Reports of the discovery quickly circulated among cryptid enthusiasts. Word-of-mouth accounts, combined with ranger observations, painted a picture of the trap as both elaborate and mysterious. Some speculated it had been constructed by private individuals, perhaps motivated by curiosity or ambition, while others suggested it might have been part of an organised attempt to document or capture a Bigfoot. The trap's location, hidden, remote, and nearly inaccessible, added to the intrigue. Forests around the Rogue River Siskiyou are known for treacherous terrain, where thick undergrowth, steep embankments, and sudden rock slides make the approach dangerous, ensuring that any structure in such a place would remain largely untouched. Even those who approached the trap cautiously reported an unsettling atmosphere. The combination of isolation, the scale of the construction, and the lingering traces of movement seemed to create a tension that was difficult to articulate. Shadows appeared to shift in unusual ways. The air felt heavier near the depression, and sounds, crunching leaves or distant snapping branches, often seemed amplified or oddly timed. Investigators noted that these sensations were subtle but persistent, contributing to a sense that the forest itself was complicit in maintaining the trap's secrecy. The trap was neither fully intact nor destroyed. Evidence suggested that it had been maintained or adjusted over time, then abandoned for reasons unknown. No capture had ever been reported, and the lack of a conclusive encounter only deepened the mystery. Over the decades, photographs, sketches, and detailed field notes became the primary record of the site. But each observer left with slightly different interpretations of what they had seen. The trap had become a point of convergence for fact, folklore, and speculation, and its discovery marked the beginning of a long investigation into both human and possibly unknown forest activity in the Rogue River Siskiyou region. After the trap's discovery, stories began to emerge from locals, hunters, and amateur investigators, each account painting a slightly different picture of what had occurred in the remote Rogue River Siskiyou forests. Some described seeing massive upright figures slipping silently among the trees, their movements deliberate yet unnervingly swift. Others insisted they had observed enormous footprints near the trap, deeper and wider than any known animal could produce, sometimes pressed into mud softened by seasonal rains. The difficulty of reconciling these accounts became immediately apparent. Even witnesses present in the same location often disagreed on size, timing, and behaviour. The earliest reports were anecdotal, passed along in hushed conversations at ranger stations, logging camps, and hunting lodges. One trapper recounted returning to the gulch after setting a small game snare, only to find it obliterated and the surrounding underbrush flattened in a pattern that did not resemble normal animal movement. Another hunter claimed to have glimpsed a massive, shadowy figure crouched near the trap, frozen in the act of examining or tampering with it before disappearing into the forest. These narratives shared a common thread, a sense of observation from an intelligent presence, yet no one could agree on what exactly they had seen. Even among those who attempted to document the events more formally, inconsistencies abounded. Photographs, footprints, and hair samples were recorded by separate parties at different times, but each dataset appeared to contradict the other. Measurements of tracks varied widely, and samples of unknown hair yielded inconclusive results when submitted to local wildlife laboratories. Some experts suggested misidentification of bears or large elk, while others noted the placement of evidence, tracks leading to the trap but not away from it, defied explanation by ordinary wildlife. The forest, with its shifting terrain and dense foliage, became a source of uncertainty, amplifying differences in testimony and observation. Psychological factors also complicated the interpretation. Witnesses frequently described a creeping unease, a heightened awareness of movement and sound, and the sense that the forest itself was observing them. Some investigators posited that this hyper-awareness, combined with the stress of isolation and difficult terrain, could exaggerate perceptions of size, speed, or intent. Yet even skeptics acknowledged that multiple accounts shared consistent details, particularly regarding the trap's location, its repeated disturbances, and unusual patterns in surrounding soil and foliage, suggesting that something tangible had occurred, even if its nature remained elusive. Over time, the accounts began to coalesce into a fragmented narrative. The trap appeared not as a static object, but as the centre of ongoing activity, a place where human ambition and unexplained phenomena intersected. The conflicting testimonies, rather than resolving the mystery, deepened it, leaving investigators to weigh credibility, environmental context, and human perception against one another. Each new report, whether recorded in journals, shared at forest meetings, or posted in modern cryptid forums, added nuance, reinforcing the idea that the rogue river Siskiyou forests held both secrets and observers, and that the trap, long abandoned but still haunting the terrain, was only a focal point for a story that remained far from understood. Investigators approached the trap not with the expectation of immediate answers, but with the understanding that the forest itself would reveal its secrets only slowly, if at all. Detailed examinations focused on the area immediately surrounding the structure: depressions in the soil, broken branches, scattered foliage, and impressions that could correspond to footprints or movement patterns. Every footprint was measured, photographed, and mapped, yet the results frequently confounded experts. Tracks varied in size and depth depending on soil moisture, yet some impressions suggested weight and stride beyond that of any known forest animal. Soil analysis revealed subtle disturbances. In places, mud and leaf litter had been compacted in a way inconsistent with normal animal traffic. Certain depressions indicated repeated pressure over time, but investigators could not determine whether this was caused by deliberate human activity, wildlife, or an unknown source. Small fragments of rope and wood, decayed but identifiable, suggested modifications to the trap, though the timing and origin remained uncertain. Each discovery prompted careful documentation, yet for every clue recorded, questions multiplied. Hair samples and other biological traces were collected with the hope of identifying species. Laboratory analysis returned inconclusive results. Some samples matched known forest animals, such as deer or black bears, while others did not correspond to any catalogued DNA from the region. Experts debated whether these discrepancies were the result of contamination, misidentification, or evidence of an unknown presence. The forest itself complicated matters further. Dense canopy, frequent precipitation, and seasonal leaf fall altered both tracks and sample preservation, leaving investigators to question whether the environment was concealing or erasing evidence. Branches snapped at irregular angles, logs shifted, and faint scuff marks on tree trunks formed patterns that were difficult to interpret. Investigators noted that the trap's depression appeared to funnel movement, as though directing creatures or objects toward a central point. Yet the direction of travel, weight, and impact patterns remained inconsistent, suggesting either repeated activity from an unknown source or natural forces amplified by the irregular terrain. Some observers noted subtle vibrations or changes in airflow near certain parts of the gulch, though no instruments could confirm these effects consistently, adding a layer of physiological mystery to the otherwise physical evidence. Efforts to reconstruct possible scenarios highlighted the forest's role as an uncooperative witness. Investigators tested hypotheses ranging from large animal interference to human tampering, even considering rare environmental phenomena, but no single explanation accounted for all observed anomalies. Each forensic observation, from hair samples to soil depressions, became a piece of a puzzle that refused to assemble cleanly. Patterns emerged, only to fracture upon closer inspection, leaving the trap simultaneously tangible and elusive. Through methodical documentation and repeated observation, the site's physicality became apparent, a location shaped by intention, use, and environmental forces, yet still resistant to definitive interpretation. Every forensic discovery revealed as much about the challenges of investigation as it did about the trap itself, ensuring that the rogue River Siskiyou wilderness remained an active participant in the story, hiding as much as it revealed and maintaining the mystery at the heart of human fascination. The Rogue River Siskiyou region has long attracted those drawn to the unexplained, and the Bigfoot trap sits within a broader history of cryptid investigation that stretches back decades. As early as the 1950s and 1960s, local enthusiasts, journalists, and amateur naturalists organised expeditions to document unusual footprints, sightings, and disturbances in these forests. These early efforts were often informal, relying on observation, rudimentary tracking, and interviews with hunters or trappers. Yet, despite their earnestness, investigators frequently returned with nothing more than sketches, photographs, or anecdotal notes, highlighting both the difficulty of navigating the rugged terrain and the elusiveness of any unknown presence. Reports from the 1970s and 1980s began to reference specific patterns in the forest. Hunters described repeated disruptions near certain gulches, broken branches at unusual heights, and large footprints that defied measurement with standard tools. Some accounts included reports of large, shadowy figures glimpsed at the periphery of vision, disappearing when approached. Researchers attempted to track these occurrences, noting the tendency for patterns to repeat seasonally, yet each attempt at documentation was frustrated by weather, steep slopes, and dense vegetation. The wilderness itself acted as both obstacle and witness, shaping the outcome of every expedition. In addition to individual investigations, small teams sometimes conducted organised searches, often inspired by media coverage or the growing folklore surrounding the trap. These groups implemented more systematic methods, mapping likely trails, measuring footprint depth and spacing, and attempting to set motion-sensitive cameras. Despite careful planning, results remained inconsistent. Some cameras recorded movement that could not be explained, while others captured only shifting shadows or wind-blown foliage. Footprint casts occasionally matched previous observations, but often impressions seemed to fade or disappear entirely, leaving investigators to question whether the forest erased evidence deliberately or if environmental factors alone were responsible. Local Forest Service records provide further context. Rangers documented disturbances along trails and in remote gulches, though most entries attributed unusual markings to bears, elk, or human activity. Few investigators formally recorded evidence of the trap itself, and in many cases reports conflicted over the location and scale of observed phenomena. These discrepancies became a recurring theme. Human memory, environmental change, and the forest's complexity ensured that even methodical observations rarely aligned, allowing speculation and folklore to flourish alongside factual documentation. Media coverage also contributed to the region's mystique. Newspaper articles, radio segments, and later television documentaries highlighted both the trap and associated sightings, blending verifiable facts with narrative embellishment. Interviews with longtime hunters or locals often contained minor contradictions, yet consistently emphasized the trap's mysterious aura and the forest's role in shaping perception. By the time these reports reached a wider audience, the Rogue River Siskiyou forests had already established a reputation as a place where conventional reasoning faltered, and where every expedition carried the possibility of both discovery and disorientation. After extensive investigation, the pattern became clear. The trap and its surrounding wilderness were more than a physical location. They were a convergence of natural terrain, human curiosity, and unexplained phenomena, creating a setting in which every expedition, whether successful or inconclusive, reinforced the sense of enduring mystery at the heart of the story. The Bigfoot trap of the Rogue River Siskiyou forests exists at the intersection of tangible evidence and enduring mystery, a place where speculation thrives as much as physical documentation. Over decades, observers and researchers have proposed a range of explanations, some rooted in biology, others in folklore or psychology. One prevailing theory suggests that large, unknown primate-like animals could inhabit the remote wilderness, their occasional appearances aligning with footprints, disturbances, and anecdotal sightings near the trap. Skeptics counter that the same evidence can often be explained by misidentified bears, elk, or even human activity, particularly in a forest where tracks can be distorted by rain, erosion, or shifting soil. Beyond biological explanations, some theorists emphasize environmental or psychological factors. The Rogue River Siskiyou forests are dense, uneven, and acoustically unpredictable. Shadows and movement can appear distorted, and natural phenomena such as fog, wind, or echoes can create the impression of figures where none exist. Witnesses often report a creeping awareness, a feeling of being watched, which may heighten perception and memory of ambiguous stimuli. In these interpretations, the trap becomes less a site of direct interaction with an unknown creature and more a focal point for human response to isolation, uncertainty, and the forest's subtle disorienting characteristics. Cultural influences also play a significant role in shaping the narrative. Local lore, indigenous oral traditions, and settler anecdotes provide a framework in which the trap and its supposed inhabitants take on meaning beyond physical evidence. Tales of towering forest dwellers and unexplained forest phenomena have been told for generations, framing both fear and fascination in ways that influence perception. When contemporary investigators enter the wilderness, they are often guided as much by these stories as by topographic maps or camera traps, interpreting subtle signs through a lens of expectation and inherited belief. Media portrayal further complicates interpretation. From newspaper clippings in the 1970s to podcasts and online forums in the 21st century, coverage of the trap often blends verified observations with anecdotal or sensationalized accounts. Each retelling amplifies certain details, the size of footprints, the audacity of alleged encounters, the intricacy of the trap, while omitting or minimizing others. This process has created a layered mythology, where fact, folklore, and speculation coexist, ensuring that the trap maintains its position as both a physical object and a narrative symbol within the broader cultural imagination. In spite of differing theories, the trap continues to provoke fascination. Its structure, location, and associated disturbances suggest intentional human interaction, yet the surrounding wilderness adds unpredictability that resists clear explanation. Every footprint, every displaced branch, and every shadow cast along the gulch fuels both curiosity and unease, allowing each observer to construct their own narrative within the framework of prior stories. In this way, the trap serves as a mirror, reflecting not only the forest's complexity, but the persistent human drive to confront and interpret the unknown. Though scrutinized for decades, no single explanation accounts for the evidence at the trap. Investigators, locals, and enthusiasts alike confront the same paradox. Tangible traces suggesting purposeful activity coexist with ambiguity, environmental interference, and conflicting accounts. The forest seems to guard its secrets deliberately, ensuring that curiosity and speculation remain entwined, and that every visit leaves more questions than answers. In recent years, the Bigfoot trap in the Rogue River Siskiyou forests has continued to attract attention from amateur investigators, cryptid enthusiasts, and documentary crews. Equipped with motion-sensitive cameras, GPS mapping, and drones, these teams hope to capture evidence of activity or clarify long-standing mysteries. Yet even with modern technology, the forest proved uncooperative. Dense canopy, tangled underbrush, and steep moss-covered slopes obscured clear lines of sight, while shadows and fog frequently distorted perception. Objects left near the trap often shifted unexpectedly, and footprints appeared or vanished in ways that resisted conventional explanation. Several expeditions attempted systematic monitoring over extended periods. Cameras set along gullies recorded movement too fast or indistinct to identify, while infrared sensors occasionally triggered with no visible cause. Some investigators reported faint vibrations underfoot or subtle changes in air pressure, phenomena impossible to reproduce reliably. Even experienced trackers admitted a growing sense of disorientation near the trap. The forest seemed to distort both perception and movement, amplifying the sense of mystery. Observers frequently commented on an almost tactile stillness, a tension in the air that pressed against their senses and seemed to intensify when they focused on the trap itself. Eyewitness reports persisted alongside these technological efforts. Hunters, hikers, and forest workers occasionally described glimpses of a large, upright figure, its features obscured by distance and foliage. Others noted guttural calls, the sound of large branches snapping, or subtle disturbances in moss and leaf litter that suggested repeated passage. Footprints remained inconsistent, often leading to the trap but rarely away, leaving investigators to speculate on whether something entered and remained unseen, or whether natural forces had created the illusion of deliberate patterns. Some teams attempted to replicate these tracks using known wildlife, but results never matched the mysterious impressions, reinforcing both the plausibility of unknown activity and the forest's ability to confound analysis. Environmental factors further complicated observation. Rain softened soil and erased footprints overnight. Fallen trees and shifting rocks altered trails. Seasonal leaf drop changed the landscape's visual cues. Even slight changes in lighting could transform familiar contours into unidentifiable shapes, and echoes through valleys frequently distorted sound. The isolation and rugged terrain meant that expeditions often required multiple days, yet subtle environmental shifts rendered repeated observations inconsistent. Investigators began to recognize a pattern. The forest itself manipulated perception, ensuring that certainty remained just out of reach. With each new technological breakthrough and expedition, the trap's origin, purpose, and any supposed encounters remain unresolved. Each visit, whether yielding photographs, anecdotal reports, or environmental measurements, adds detail but no definitive answers. The forest, the trap, and the stories surrounding them continue to interact in unpredictable ways, creating a space where speculation, evidence, and human imagination converge. The Bigfoot trap persists not as a solved puzzle but as a locus of enduring intrigue, challenging each new observer to reconcile tangible traces with uncertainty, and leaving the wilderness and those who enter it unsettled and searching. Somewhere in the shadowed gulch, the trap waits still, silent and intact, as if the forest itself preserves what no human curiosity has yet fully revealed. Laser Cave and the silent evidence beneath the trees. The dense forests of the Pacific Northwest conceal secrets that resist discovery, their tangled undergrowth and steep slopes forming natural barriers to casual exploration. Among these hidden enclaves, Laser Cave remained largely unknown for decades. Tucked beneath a series of moss-covered ridges and overhung by ancient firs whose roots twisted like gnarled fingers into the soil. The first recorded approach to the site came not from an organised scientific expedition, but from a pair of local hikers navigating a little-used trail in late autumn, when fallen leaves obscured the ground and shadows lengthened with the low sun. Their initial goal had been a routine mapping of the region's small tributary streams, but the subtle dip in terrain and the hint of a rock overhang drew their attention, revealing a cavity that had gone unnoticed in previous surveys. As they examined the opening, they noted the unusual arrangement of stone and debris at its entrance. Small boulders appeared deliberately placed, forming a loose barrier that both marked and concealed the cave. Nearby, faint impressions in the soil suggested repeated passage, though the size and depth of these depressions defied easy identification. The hikers' instincts told them that this was more than a natural shelter or a simple animal den, yet there was no immediate evidence to suggest human construction or habitation. The forest around the cave seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying foliage, amplifying the quiet and the subtle tension that accompanied the discovery. Initial photographs and sketches captured what could be observed: irregular stone patterns, subtle depressions, and a faintly worn path leading to the cave mouth. Even these modest records hinted at complexity. The slope above the opening was strewn with fallen branches and moss, yet clear depressions in softer soil indicated repeated travel, as if something or someone had moved deliberately to and from the site. The hikers reported an unusual stillness. The forest seemed less a backdrop than a participant, its sounds dampened and shadows deepened around the cave. Every footstep near the opening felt amplified, and the simplest movement through the undergrowth produced echoes that suggested greater activity than could be accounted for by two humans alone. Word of the discovery reached local Forest Service officials, who noted the cave in their logs but refrained from extensive investigation, citing difficult access and preservation concerns. Over the next several months, additional observers visited the site, each noting small variations. Stones shifted, impressions changed shape, and subtle traces appeared or disappeared depending on season and weather. The cumulative observations suggested not just occasional visitation, but repeated activity over time, yet no direct evidence of a responsible agent could be identified. Even as interest grew, Laser Cave remained elusive. Its location, concealed by dense underbrush and irregular terrain, limited the number of observers able to approach, and the surrounding forest acted as a veil, preserving whatever occurred inside. From the outset, it became clear that the cave would not yield its secrets easily. Every footstep brought discovery, yet each discovery only raised further questions about what had entered, who or what had moved among the stones, and what remained silent beneath the trees. Once attention shifted to Laser Cave, investigators began cataloguing the subtle traces that distinguished the site from ordinary forest clearings. The entrance itself offered the first puzzle. Shallow depressions in soil and leaf litter suggested repeated travel, yet measurements of depth, width and spacing defied alignment with typical wildlife. Some impressions appeared to match the weight of a human adult, while others suggested something considerably larger or heavier. Twigs snapped in unusual patterns, and moss clinging to rocks near the mouth was disturbed in ways that hinted at movement across multiple surfaces, rather than a single path in and out. Each anomaly, while minor in isolation, collectively suggested deliberate activity around the cave that resisted straightforward explanation. Small fragments of detritus offered additional questions. Faint scorch marks on stones near the cave mouth could not be attributed to controlled campfires, and fragments of charred plant material did not match any known stove or human ignition method in the region. Soil samples taken from depressions contained tiny inclusions, sand grains out of place, minute organic remnants that seemed to indicate repeated disturbance. Investigators noted that some tracks appeared partially overlaid by others, implying a pattern of passage over time. These overlapping impressions suggested either multiple individuals or repeated activity by a single entity, though no definitive conclusion could be drawn. The forest floor revealed further irregularities. Small piles of rocks, partially covered in moss and leaf litter, appeared positioned with care, as though marking points of significance. Some stones bore faint scratches and abrasion consistent with dragging or moving objects, though no definitive tools or implements were found nearby. Investigators measured angles, distances, and alignments between these stone clusters, finding patterns that seemed almost deliberate yet inconsistent enough to frustrate attempts at a clear interpretation. Environmental factors, rain, wind, falling debris, complicated the analysis, altering impressions and scattering material in ways that mimicked intentional activity. Biological traces added to the uncertainty. Hairs and fur-like fibers were collected, but laboratory analysis returned inconclusive results. Some strands resembled known local mammals, such as bobcats or black bears, while others did not match any catalogued DNA in regional databases. The ambiguity left both skeptics and enthusiasts questioning whether these anomalies were the result of misidentification, contamination, or evidence of an unknown presence. Even the most experienced trackers admitted that the combination of subtle signs, overlapping tracks, and ambiguous biological traces created an interpretive challenge unlike anything they had encountered in similar Pacific Northwest forests. Observers also noted the forest's acoustic and visual influence on perception. Sound carried irregularly through the ravines and ridges surrounding the cave, making distant movements seem closer or louder than they actually were. Light filtering through the canopy created shifting shadows that altered depth perception and suggested movement where none existed. Investigators found that even careful photographic documentation could be misleading, as minor changes in angle or timing produced images of distorted impressions. Each layer of observation, from footprints to environmental conditions, reinforced the sense that Laser Cave existed as both a physical site and an enigmatic locus of interpretation, where human curiosity encountered a wilderness capable of shaping perception as much as hiding its secrets. Alongside the physical evidence, Laser Cave became a focal point for stories and observations passed down by locals and forest workers, creating a complex tapestry of first-hand accounts that rarely aligned yet consistently hinted at something unexplained. Some hikers reported sudden, inexplicable shifts in temperature near the cave, describing a chill that seemed confined to the immediate vicinity of the entrance. Others spoke of distant rustling, the breaking of branches at precise intervals, or fleeting glimpses of movement that disappeared before it could be fully perceived. While each report varied, together they suggested that the cave and surrounding forest exerted a subtle influence on those who approached, magnifying small disturbances into experiences that defied easy explanation. Long-time forest workers contributed narratives that combined observation with instinct. Several described the feeling of being watched when passing near the cave, a sense of awareness without a visible source. One veteran ranger noted that on multiple occasions he'd found footprints near the cave that appeared overnight, only to vanish after a day of rain or shifting debris. His accounts emphasized that the cave's anomalies were not limited to rare sightings, but were instead recurring patterns in the environment, observable to anyone familiar with the forest's usual conditions. Such reports lent weight to the notion that Laser Cave was a site of repeated activity, yet they offered no definitive answers regarding who or what was responsible. Indigenous oral traditions add another layer to the narrative, though modern documentation is sparse. Tribes of the region have long recounted stories of shadowed places in the forest, where spirits or other unseen forces dwell, often using cautionary tales to explain why certain ravines or cave systems should be approached carefully. While these stories do not provide concrete evidence of physical activity, they establish a framework for understanding the cave's place in cultural memory. Investigators have noted that local cautionary tales often align with areas later found to contain unusual physical traces, suggesting a historical awareness of phenomena that science has yet to fully account for. Conflicting details between witnesses created further challenges. Some hikers claimed they had seen impressions too large for a human foot, while others observed smaller, more human-like markings. Reports of sound varied dramatically, from low, guttural tones echoing through the trees to sharp snaps of branches that seemed timed with the observer's movement. Even the most cautious recorders noted that forest conditions, fog, shadows, wind, could alter perception, making each account simultaneously credible and questionable. One researcher remarked that even trained senses could be deceived here, as the forest seemed to amplify uncertainty, turning ordinary phenomena into something that felt deliberate. Visitors frequently reported an uncanny sense that something lingered just beyond the visible, as if the cave itself were observing them in return. These accounts, combined with local legend, positioned Laser Cave as more than a mere geological formation. It became a space where physical evidence, human perception, and cultural memory intersected. Every new visitor added to the evolving story, leaving impressions, observations, or anecdotes that built upon those before. Yet none could resolve the central mystery. The cave existed as a nexus of observation and speculation, a site where the boundary between natural explanation and unknown phenomena remained elusive, and where each encounter underscored the enduring enigma hidden beneath the trees. Following the accumulation of eyewitness reports and anecdotal accounts, professional investigators and forensic teams began approaching Laser Cave with systematic methodology, hoping to move beyond speculation into verifiable observation. Initial expeditions focused on careful mapping of the cave entrance and surrounding terrain, recording slope gradients, soil composition, and potential natural features that could explain anomalies. Each step revealed the forest's persistent influence. Fallen branches, moss-covered stones, and irregular soil textures created visual and tactile patterns that could easily be misread as evidence of repeated visitation. Investigators quickly learned that precision alone would not suffice. Every measurement risked distortion by environmental variables beyond their control. Soil and sediment analysis became a central component of the study. Samples from depressions near the cave were examined for composition, density, and signs of repeated compression. Some areas contained higher than expected concentrations of organic matter and fragmented plant material, suggestive of repeated movement, yet the precise cause remained uncertain. Scientists attempted to replicate impressions using human weight, local wildlife, and combinations of tools, but no arrangement produced a perfect match. Each test highlighted the forest's role as a subtle but active participant, capable of altering tracks and impressions in ways that confounded straightforward interpretation. Investigators also examined stone arrangements near the cave entrance. Some rocks bore faint abrasion marks, possibly from dragging or repeated handling. Researchers documented distances, angles, and alignment between these stones, considering whether they might constitute markers, traps, or remnants of ritualistic activity. Photographic evidence revealed that minor shifts in camera angle or sunlight dramatically altered perceived patterns, further complicating objective analysis. Even after repeated visits, the investigators noted that no two observations were entirely identical, reinforcing the notion that the forest could mask, amplify, or distort human perception. Biological and trace evidence were collected for laboratory testing. Hairs and fibres discovered near the cave offered ambiguous results. Some samples matched regional mammals such as bobcats and black bears, while others returned inconclusive results or did not match any known species in local DNA databases. Despite extensive testing, no definitive conclusion could be drawn about their origin, leaving both researchers and skeptics in a state of uncertainty. Even the most experienced forensic analysts acknowledged that the combination of ambiguous traces, environmental interference, and subtle patterns created an interpretive challenge rarely encountered elsewhere. Acoustic and environmental monitoring supplemented the physical investigations. Sensitive microphones recorded the natural frequencies of wind and wildlife, yet occasional anomalies, unexplained snaps, shifts in air pressure and distant rustling remained unaccounted for. Investigators speculated that some disturbances could result from complex interactions between terrain, vegetation and microclimates, but the exact mechanisms remained elusive. The forest resisted reduction to simple cause and effect, demonstrating that even careful methodical study could yield only partial insight. Though these efforts were thorough, Laser Cave continued to guard its secrets. Each expedition produced detailed logs, environmental data, and photographic documentation, yet no single theory fully accounted for all evidence. The site remained a convergence of subtle physical traces, human perception, and forest interference, where every layer of observation raised further questions. Even the most methodical approach could not extract certainty, leaving Laser Cave as a locus of enduring ambiguity and quiet, persistent tension within the Pacific Northwest wilderness. Long before modern investigators approached Laser Cave with cameras and DNA swabs, the forest had drawn attention for its peculiarities, and earlier expeditions, often informal and poorly documented, hinted at the cave's enduring mystery. In the early 20th century, local trappers and timber workers occasionally noted unusual formations along the slopes above the creek, referencing depressions, irregular stone arrangements, and faint pathways that seemed incongruous with the surrounding terrain. These observers lacked the tools of modern forensic study, yet their journals and oral accounts consistently describe the cave and its surroundings as different or unsettling, suggesting that even minimal scrutiny revealed something beyond the ordinary. By the 1950s, amateur cavers and explorers began venturing into the Pacific Northwest's more remote regions, mapping caves, documenting rock formations, and sometimes reporting strange anomalies. Laser Cave occasionally appeared in regional bulletins, often mentioned in passing alongside reports of unusual tracks or fleeting glimpses of movement. One expedition from 1957 noted that footprints near the cave entrance did not correspond to any animal catalogued in the area, and that the alignment of stones and depressions implied repeated visitation. However, logistical challenges and limited access meant that observations were often incomplete, leaving gaps in the historical record that would persist for decades. Local accounts from this period add nuance to the scientific record. Timber crews occasionally reported hearing what they described as low, rhythmic thuds or faint scraping noises near the cave, often at night. Though such reports were anecdotal, they suggested that repeated activity, human, animal, or otherwise, occurred around the site. Folkloric elements also began to coalesce during this period, as tales circulated of mysterious cave dwellers or elusive figures observed in the forest. These stories, while sometimes dismissed as superstition, were consistent enough to appear in multiple independent accounts, lending a pattern to what might otherwise be considered random observation. Later expeditions in the 1970s and 1980s attempted more methodical documentation, though they too faced the challenges of dense undergrowth, variable weather, and difficult terrain. Photographs captured depressions and subtle stone arrangements, yet the lack of repeated, verifiable patterns left the cave's purpose and the origin of the anomalies unresolved. Observers consistently noted that even minor seasonal changes, rainfall, fallen foliage, or wind, could alter impressions, obscure evidence, and create entirely new formations, reinforcing the forest's role as an unpredictable agent in the ongoing mystery. Across generations, a recurring theme emerges: every expedition, regardless of skill, equipment, or intent, was constrained by the cave's environment. The forest shaped perception as much as it concealed evidence, ensuring that each historical record offered glimpses but never certainty. From the earliest trappers to modern teams, Laser Cave has resisted clear interpretation, existing as a locus where human curiosity intersects with natural ambiguity. Even as investigators revisited the site with increasingly sophisticated tools, the cave's history and prior observations remained central to understanding its enduring enigma, reminding each new visitor that the forest preserves its secrets with a quiet, implacable patience. In reviewing the historical record, investigators noted a curious consistency. Subtle signs of movement or disturbance appeared regardless of who visited the site, suggesting that the forest itself dictated the terms of observation. Seasonal shifts, wildlife activity, and even human interference seemed to interact in unpredictable ways, leaving impressions that could be read multiple ways depending on the observer's perspective. These patterns created a layered narrative across decades, one in which every past expedition became both a source of information and a reminder of the cave's ability to confound understanding. In this sense, the historical record was not merely a chronicle of exploration, but an active participant in the ongoing mystery, shaping how subsequent investigators approached each visit with a mixture of caution, curiosity, and unease. With several years of observations, expeditions, and anecdotal accounts behind them, investigators and enthusiasts turned to theory, attempting to reconcile the physical anomalies of Laser Cave with the persistent sense of mystery that surrounded it. One of the most straightforward explanations focused on natural processes. Erosion, shifting soil, fallen debris, and animal activity could account for many of the impressions and subtle disturbances. Proponents of this view argued that the irregular stone formations might result from landslides or natural sorting of rocks, while footprints and depressions could be the work of bears, deer, or other wildlife moving repeatedly along constrained paths. Yet even those who advocated a natural origin admitted that some patterns, overlapping impressions, unusually consistent depressions, and selective disturbance of moss-covered stones defied simple environmental explanations. Others explored the possibility of human interaction. Local trappers, hunters, or transient campers could have moved stones or left traces intentionally or inadvertently, creating patterns that later observers misinterpreted. Evidence such as faint paths leading toward and away from the cave, small piles of rocks arranged in deliberate-seeming configurations, and charred plant fragments hinted at repeated human presence. Still, historical records, seasonal variations, and the forest's inaccessibility complicated this theory. No known individuals could account for all anomalies, and repeated shifts in the terrain suggested activity beyond what could be reasonably explained by casual or transient visitors. Some speculators turned to the possibility of unknown wildlife. The Pacific Northwest has long been a site of cryptid lore, from Sasquatch to mysterious forest-dwelling mammals. Observers noted that certain impressions and traces, size, depth, and shape, did not correspond neatly to any documented species, leaving room for the possibility of an undiscovered animal capable of inhabiting the cave and surrounding forests undetected. While no definitive evidence supports this hypothesis, proponents cite recurring patterns in tracks and disturbances as suggestive, arguing that repeated human encounters may have been too brief or sporadic to capture fully on record. Psychological and environmental interpretations also gained traction. The dense canopy, shifting light, fog, and acoustics of the forest create conditions in which perception is easily distorted. Shadows, echoes, and subtle vibrations in the underbrush can amplify ordinary movements, producing experiences that feel intentional, directed, or even sentient. Witnesses frequently described a creeping awareness or the sense of being observed, phenomena that, while subjective, were consistent across multiple accounts spanning decades. These interpretations suggest that Laser Cave may act as a focal point for human perception, where the forest itself becomes a participant in shaping mystery. Finally, a synthesis of theories emerged among some researchers, acknowledging that no single explanation fully resolves the cave's enigma. Natural processes, human activity, unknown wildlife, and perceptual distortion may all operate simultaneously, creating layered anomalies that appear purposeful yet resist conclusive interpretation. In this view, Laser Cave exists not merely as a physical site but as a dynamic intersection of forest, history and human observation, where each layer of evidence interacts with perception to sustain the enduring sense of uncertainty. These pieces of evidence include footprints, stone arrangements, biological traces and anecdotal reports. Even the most meticulous record-keeping and modern analysis cannot fully account for the cave's persistent anomalies, and each new observer leaves the site with fresh questions. The forest around the cave continues to act as a quiet arbiter, permitting only glimpses of understanding before retreating into silence and shadow. In the last several generations, Laser Cave has become a destination for researchers armed with sophisticated cameras, motion-sensitive devices, GPS mapping systems, and environmental sensors designed to record subtle variations in temperature, humidity, and soil movement. Each team approached the cave hoping to capture the anomalies that had eluded documentation for decades. Yet even with these tools, the cave remained enigmatic. Investigators consistently observed depressions in the soil that reappeared in roughly the same positions, stones subtly displaced in patterns that resisted immediate explanation, and fleeting shadows or movements that appeared only briefly in camera frames. Infrared imagery and time-lapse photography occasionally captured shapes or disturbances that could not be traced to wildlife or human presence, reinforcing the cave's reputation as a site of enduring mystery. Detailed mapping of the surrounding forest revealed how profoundly terrain and vegetation shaped observation. Variations in soil density, moss coverage, and undergrowth created illusions of footprints or paths where none existed. Dense canopy and uneven topography distorted sound and light, making ordinary branches or leaves seem to move purposefully. Even with repeated visits, investigators found that impressions changed after rainfall, windstorms, or animal activity, creating a constantly shifting tableau that resisted simple documentation. Some researchers noted that the forest seemed almost deliberate in its interference, shaping the conditions of observation and ensuring that no expedition could claim complete clarity. Biological sampling added another layer of complexity. Hair, fur, and other organic traces found near the cave occasionally matched known wildlife, including black bears, bobcats, and raccoons, yet other samples returned inconclusive results or failed to match any species in regional DNA records. The presence of unexplained strands prompted speculation that the cave might host unknown or rare animals, or that environmental contamination had complicated collection and analysis. Even when analysis yielded conventional results, the unusual placement and distribution of traces suggested patterns that defied typical wildlife behavior, leaving investigators unable to confirm a purely natural origin. Acoustic monitoring further illustrated the cave's ambiguous nature. Microphones and vibration sensors recorded distant snapping, rustling, and low-frequency hums that could not be definitively attributed to wind, water, or animal activity. Some sequences mimicked deliberate motion or footsteps, yet visual confirmation was never possible. Field researchers remarked on the sense of tension these sounds created, as if the forest itself were testing perception, offering signals that were simultaneously observable and elusive, reinforcing the cave's role as a locus of uncertainty where evidence and interpretation became intertwined. Even with these modern tools, the cave resisted final explanation. Each expedition added detailed logs, photographic documentation, and sensor data, yet no pattern emerged that could fully account for the anomalies. Every footprint, displaced stone, or ambiguous trace layered additional uncertainty atop decades of observation, creating a cumulative narrative of mystery. Visitors frequently remarked that the cave's very presence seemed to manipulate perception, allowing only fragments of understanding while preserving the full enigma. Laser Cave continues to exist as a threshold between the known and the unknown, where every attempt at explanation deepens rather than resolves the forest's enduring secrets. Though countless hours of observation, measurement, and relentless curiosity have passed, the cave remains as it always was, a quiet sentinel of the forest, offering only fragments while guarding its deepest secrets in shadow. Ape Cave and the underground forest that feels untouched by time. Approaching Ape Cave, the first impression is of a forest suspended between eras, where the canopy stretches thick and ancient overhead, filtering sunlight into muted shafts that barely reach the moss-covered ground. The trail leading to the cave winds through fallen logs and dense undergrowth, each step met with the soft, almost imperceptible creak of old timber and the rustle of hidden wildlife. The forest seems to hold its breath here, as though aware of the cave's presence and intent on preserving its secrets. For explorers, the boundary between the known and unknown begins long before the mouth of the cave itself, in the way the forest isolates and disorients, amplifying both anticipation and unease. Geologically, Ape Cave is a product of the volcanic flows from Mount St. Helens, a lava tube that extends more than 2 miles underground. Its entrance opens subtly into the forest floor, partly concealed by vegetation and fallen boulders, suggesting that time has been unhurried here. Early explorers often described the transition from the bright forest into the shadowed mouth of the tube as abrupt, a shift in both light and atmosphere that produces a tangible sense of entering another world. The air inside is cooler, denser, carrying a faint earthy scent of damp rock and organic decay, and every echo carries further than expected, creating the impression that the cave itself is listening. Historical context deepens the sense of mystery. Though local indigenous peoples were aware of the lava tubes and may have used them for navigation or shelter, written records only appear in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when spelunkers began mapping the region. Even in these early explorations, descriptions of Ape Cave emphasize its untouched nature, its minimal interference from human activity, and the eerie sense that each passage has remained largely unchanged for centuries. Photographs from the early 1900s show entrances almost entirely concealed by foliage, belying the complex networks of chambers and tunnels that lie beyond. The forest surrounding Ape Cave further complicates perception. Its dense canopy, intermittent fog, and thick understory create shadows and movements that seem deliberate, while the low hum of distant streams or wind passing through trees can produce auditory illusions. Every explorer entering the cave for the first time must contend with a layered environment where natural sounds and sights are amplified, shifted, or distorted, giving ordinary features a sense of intent or sentience. In these moments, the forest feels like an active participant in the experience, shaping impressions as much as the cave itself. Even before stepping inside the juxtaposition of ancient lava formations, the dense, quietly observant forest, and the subtle disorientation of light and sound instills a lingering sense of anticipation. Each expedition, no matter how carefully planned, confronts the cave with both tools and trepidation, aware that the underground passages are as much a challenge to human perception as they are a site for scientific observation. Ape Cave presents a threshold where time, geology, and the forest converge, leaving visitors to negotiate the subtle interplay between environment and expectation, and where every step taken feels guided by forces beyond human understanding. The earliest mentions of Ape Cave in recorded history appear sporadically, often as brief notes in regional journals or in the accounts of early spelunkers mapping the volcanic landscape of Mount St. Helens. While indigenous oral traditions suggest that local peoples were aware of the lava tubes and may have used them for navigation or temporary shelter, the precise details remain fragmentary, leaving a gap between legend and documented exploration. By the late 19th century, prospectors, timber workers, and naturalists began to venture into the region, drawn by the promise of geological discovery and the dense, seemingly impenetrable forest surrounding the tube. Their accounts frequently emphasize the cave's untouched quality, noting that even after the passage of decades, it appeared largely unchanged from the description passed down by prior observers. Early explorers often relied on rudimentary equipment, lanterns, ropes, and hand-drawn maps. Their reports describe the cave as both awe-inspiring and unsettling, a space where the scale and texture of the lava formations challenged comprehension. Some early journals highlight the eerily silent passages, where the usual sounds of a forest, wind, bird calls, or the rustling of small mammals were replaced by an enveloping stillness. Explorers noted that even minor disturbances, such as the placement of a lantern or a footstep on loose rock, echoed unnaturally, lending a sense of presence to what seemed otherwise empty corridors. These observations contributed to a narrative in which the cave itself became a character, an unyielding and observant entity that resisted full documentation. Inconsistencies in early maps and accounts add to the cave's enduring mystery. Measurements of tunnel lengths, chamber sizes, and passage orientation often varied between expeditions, suggesting either the difficulty of surveying in low light and uneven terrain, or the existence of passages that shifted or eroded over time. Some explorers reported faint trails leading to side chambers that others could not locate, while others described small alcoves or openings whose presence could not be verified on subsequent visits. These discrepancies fueled speculation that the cave's interior might be more dynamic than previously assumed, with natural processes subtly reshaping the underground landscape. Alongside documented exploration, anecdotal accounts introduced a layer of folklore that has persisted into modern investigations. Timber workers, hunters, and occasional hikers described unusual footprints near cave entrances, fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures, and sounds that resembled deliberate movement. While some dismissed these reports as misidentifications of wildlife or optical illusions, the repetition of certain details across decades created patterns too consistent to ignore entirely. Investigators today often revisit these early testimonies, seeking correlations between historical observations and contemporary anomalies in the cave's structure and environment. Through the combination of journal entries, oral accounts, and early maps, a portrait emerges of Ape Cave as a place that has long captured human attention, not only for its geological significance, but also for its capacity to inspire curiosity and unease. Each expedition built upon the fragmentary record of those who came before, yet the cave retained its air of elusiveness. Even at this early stage, it was clear that Ape Cave would resist simple explanation, offering explorers glimpses of its complexity while withholding a full account of its hidden passages, its subtle environmental distortions, and the sense of observation that seemed to accompany every intrusion into its dark interior. Before even entering Ape Cave, the forest above exerts an unmistakable influence on perception, shaping the experience of anyone approaching the lava tube. Towering conifers, centuries old, form a dense canopy that filters sunlight into muted shafts, casting shifting patterns across the moss-laden forest floor. The ground is uneven, covered with decaying logs, loose stones, and tangled undergrowth that muffles footsteps yet amplifies faint sounds. A twig snapping or a distant animal call seems to echo unnaturally, as though the forest itself were listening. Explorers frequently report a creeping awareness of isolation, a heightened sense of vulnerability, even when only a few hundred feet from the cave entrance. Fog and seasonal mist add another layer of uncertainty. On mornings when low clouds settle into the forest, familiar shapes blur and vanish, creating illusions of movement or figures in the periphery. Light refracts strangely through the foliage, exaggerating shadows and depth. And explorers often recount moments when a simple branch or fallen log seems animate, only to reveal itself as static moments later. The forest becomes a perceptual filter, magnifying small details into seemingly deliberate signals, and even seasoned investigators find their observations coloured by the forest's subtle manipulation of sound, sight, and spatial awareness. Wildlife also plays a complex role in shaping perception. Black bears, bobcats, and deer traverse the area with predictable yet unpredictable patterns, leaving tracks that can appear human-like under poor visibility or after erosion alters their contours. Birds, from the occasional crow to hidden owls, call and flutter in ways that echo through the trees, creating rhythmic or punctuated sounds that suggest movement beyond the immediate line of sight. Even insects contribute to an auditory tapestry that can make silence feel unnatural, and every rustle or snap is magnified against the profound quiet that dominates much of the forest. The forest's influence extends to psychological and emotional states. Explorers often describe a disorienting effect when they pause, sensing a gaze from unseen observers or the impression of being followed even when alone. The combination of dim light, dense vegetation, and subtle sensory cues produces a heightened state of awareness, where ordinary events, wind, falling leaves, distant wildlife, are interpreted as deliberate, meaningful, or even threatening. This perceptual distortion primes visitors for the experience inside the cave, ensuring that they enter already attuned to ambiguity, expectation, and uncertainty. Even the approach paths to the cave seem to contribute to this sense of dislocation. Trails are rarely straight, often winding around fallen logs, boulders, or dense patches of undergrowth, forcing explorers to adjust their pace and focus constantly. Each step feels measured, deliberate, and aware of the unseen terrain ahead. The forest, in essence, functions as a prelude to the cave, conditioning explorers to anticipate anomalies and to interpret every impression as potentially significant. By the time the cave entrance appears, partially hidden, shadowed, and silent, the visitor is already immersed in a landscape that challenges perception, primes curiosity and subtly amplifies the sense that the underground world ahead may be even less understandable than the forest that guards it. Stepping into Ape Cave, the transition from forest to underground is immediate and tangible. The air grows cooler and heavier, carrying the faint mineral scent of basalt and the lingering dampness of centuries of condensation. Light from lanterns or headlamps falls upon the uneven floor, revealing layers of hardened lava that twist and fold into formations both intricate and alien. Shadows stretch unnaturally across the walls, amplified by every irregular surface, while echoes of footsteps bounce unpredictably, creating a disorienting sense of motion where none exists. For first-time explorers, the cave appears as an underground forest in miniature, a space untouched by time, where every stone and crevice retains the memory of the lava flow that created it. The floor of the cave is littered with formations that defy easy interpretation. In some areas, smooth, polished basalt resembles pathways deliberately worn by repeated movement, while nearby jagged edges suggest violent cooling and fracturing of molten rock. Small depressions and indentations invite speculation. Are these natural irregularities traces of animals, or evidence of unknown visitors? Water dripping from overhead fissures adds further complexity, carving channels in soft ash and creating pools that mirror distorted reflections of the ceiling. Explorers often pause, noting that even minor adjustments to light or positioning reveal features previously hidden, emphasizing the cave's dynamic, mutable character. Passageways within Ape Cave vary dramatically, forcing visitors to navigate narrow tubes, wide chambers, and descending slopes that seem to double back on themselves. Some tunnels terminate abruptly, leaving investigators to speculate on collapses or natural blockages that may have altered the cave's interior over centuries. Other passages extend into darkness, with ceilings low enough to brush but walls that expand into chambers large enough to evoke a sense of scale comparable to the forest above. The complex geometry complicates orientation. Repeated expeditions have struggled to reconcile maps and measurements, highlighting how the cave resists complete documentation. Acoustic phenomena further amplify the cave's enigmatic character. Even faint footsteps echo as though amplified, while distant dripping air currents or rock fractures produce sounds that can be mistaken for deliberate movement. Observers describe a disquieting sensation of presence, as if the cave is simultaneously inhabited and vacant. Every adjustment of light or shift in perspective seems to uncover new impressions, patterns in rock, shadow, or mineral deposits that suggest intention, though any explanation remains elusive. The interplay of scale, sound, and visual distortion ensures that perception within the cave is constantly challenged, demanding attention to detail while leaving certainty just out of reach. Despite repeated documentation, certain anomalies continue to resist explanation. Stones appear slightly displaced from one visit to the next, minor depressions deepen or shift, and subtle traces suggest movement that cannot be attributed to human or known animal activity. Explorers note that the cave's interior feels alive in its own way, a space where natural processes and time create layers of complexity that no single observer can fully unravel. Within this subterranean world, Ape Cave asserts its untamed character, demanding respect, patience, and meticulous attention, and reminding every visitor that it is a place where human understanding may only ever scratch the surface of a far larger, deeper reality. Within Ape Cave, explorers often encounter evidence that appears tangible yet defies consistent interpretation. Footprints of unusual size and shape have been documented in soft sediment or along ash-laden floors, sometimes appearing isolated, other times in sequences that suggest deliberate movement. The origins of these prints remain hotly debated. Some investigators attribute them to bears, elk, or other wildlife navigating the cave during periods of higher humidity, while others insist the size and stride pattern exceed anything documented among known regional fauna. Adding to the confusion, repeated expeditions have occasionally failed to find the same prints, leaving observers to question whether environmental factors, erosion, condensation, or accidental disturbance alter or erase tracks faster than they can be documented. Acoustic anomalies further complicate interpretation. Visitors describe low rumbles, tapping, and subtle shuffles that seem to correspond with certain areas of the cave, yet instruments often fail to record these sounds with clarity. Teams using high-sensitivity microphones report faint vibrations that defy correlation with airflow, water movement, or known wildlife, producing conflicting datasets between expeditions. Some investigators claim to hear patterns that suggest deliberate pacing, while others dismiss these as optical and auditory illusions amplified by expectation and tension. The repeated inconsistency between personal observation and technical recording fuels uncertainty, and every discrepancy raises questions about the reliability of both human perception and scientific methodology in such an unusual environment. Lighting and shadow introduce another layer of ambiguity. The cave's uneven surfaces create illusions of depth, motion, or figures where none exist, particularly when explorers rely on lanterns or headlamps that cast narrow beams. Photographs often reveal shapes unseen to the human eye at the time of capture, while certain formations interpreted as footprints, alcoves, or depressions vanish under different angles or lighting conditions. Longitudinal studies of these features show slight variations caused by temperature shifts, condensation, or sediment displacement, blurring the line between anomaly and natural process. Even experienced cavers admit that the environment itself seems to play with perception, amplifying uncertainty and producing repeated disagreements among those who document the same areas. Testimonies from multiple expeditions illustrate how context and expectation influence interpretation. A single unusual noise may be interpreted as an animal by one team, as deliberate pacing by another, and dismissed entirely by a third. Similarly, a mark in the ash might be logged as a footprint, a piece of fallen rock, or an unidentifiable anomaly, depending on the observer's background and prior beliefs. The convergence of human expectation, environmental complexity, and the cave's mutable conditions ensures that no single account provides a definitive record, leaving only a patchwork of partial observations, contradictions, and lingering questions. Even with meticulous documentation, Ape Cave resists certainty. Each expedition contributes fragments to an evolving record, yet no consensus emerges. Observers find themselves in a space where the environment, history, and perception intersect, producing anomalies that persist without resolution. The cave's network of passages, hidden alcoves, and mutable surfaces ensures that every footprint, sound, or shadow may be interpreted differently depending on the conditions of observation, reinforcing a central truth. Ape Cave is a site in which certainty is fleeting, and the forest above continues to shape both the evidence and the observer's understanding. As conflicting observations accumulated, researchers and enthusiasts began constructing multiple interpretations to account for the anomalies within Ape Cave. The most conventional explanations focus on natural processes, lava flow patterns, erosion, water seepage, and the unpredictable behavior of wildlife. Large mammals such as bears, elk, or bobcats can traverse cave passages and leave footprints that appear human-like under certain conditions, particularly when sediment or ash distorts size and shape. Dripping water and air currents can produce the low-frequency hums and tapping sounds reported by explorers, while temperature fluctuations subtly shift rocks, debris, and dust, creating impressions of deliberate movement. In spite of these plausible explanations, some anomalies resist neat categorization. Investigators have documented marks, scratches, and indentations that do not align with known species or patterns of erosion. The cave's acoustic environment amplifies and distorts ordinary sounds, yet certain sequences of tapping or movement seem purposeful, occurring in locations that would be unlikely for standard wildlife activity. These unaccounted for traces prompt speculation about unknown fauna, elusive subterranean creatures, or interactions that elude conventional scientific frameworks. Observers note that the unpredictability of the cave allows room for interpretation, yet simultaneously limits definitive conclusions. Psychological and environmental factors further complicate understanding. Human perception in low-light enclosed spaces is inherently prone to error, particularly in conditions of sensory overload or tension. Shadows, echoes, and reflected light can create illusions of movement or figures, while fatigue, anticipation, and expectation can shape memory and recall. Experienced cavers recognize that even meticulous documentation is influenced by these factors, and that repeated visits can reveal entirely different impressions of the same passage or chamber. The interplay of perception and environment ensures that every account, no matter how careful, remains filtered through human subjectivity. Cultural influence also shapes the narrative surrounding Ape Cave. Local folklore, historical anecdotes, and modern retellings in books, documentaries, and online forums contribute to the cave's reputation as a place of mystery. Tales of unseen observers, shadowy figures, and unusual sounds are shared alongside scientific observation, often blurring the line between empirical evidence and storytelling. New explorers inevitably approach with these narratives in mind, interpreting footprints, sounds, and formations against a backdrop of expectation inherited from previous visitors. In this sense, the cave becomes a canvas on which both environment and imagination leave marks, producing a layered mythology that evolves with each generation of observers. Some theorists have even speculated on cryptid or unknown species inhabiting the cave, drawing on patterns in footprints, elusive movement, and anomalies in acoustic recordings. While no definitive evidence supports the existence of such creatures, the persistence of these theories underscores the cave's ability to generate questions that defy easy resolution. Whether through natural processes, perceptual distortion, or genuine mystery, Ape Cave demonstrates a unique capacity to challenge understanding. Every hypothesis, regardless of plausibility, is measured against a physical and psychological environment that seems intent on preserving ambiguity, ensuring that the cave remains as compelling and elusive to modern researchers as it was to early explorers. In modern times, Ape Cave has attracted the attention of scientific teams equipped with technology far beyond what early explorers could imagine. High-resolution cameras, infrared sensors, LiDAR mapping equipment, and environmental monitoring devices have all been deployed in attempts to capture evidence of the cave's elusive phenomena. These modern tools allow researchers to document temperature fluctuations, air currents, moisture levels, and subtle vibrations in ways that reveal patterns imperceptible to the human eye or ear. Yet, even with these advancements, the cave continues to confound expectations, producing results that are often ambiguous or contradictory. Repeated mapping exercises using LiDAR have revealed the cave's intricate geometry and unprecedented detail, highlighting twists, alcoves, and hidden side passages previously unrecorded. Yet these maps alone fail to explain the anomalies reported for decades, impressions that appear to shift location, subtle disturbances in sediment or rock, and acoustic events that seem deliberate. Some areas, perfectly documented one day, appear altered after rainfall, seismic activity, or even minor wind-induced vibration in the forest above. Investigators frequently note that every dataset must be interpreted within a mutable environment. Where natural forces conspire to maintain uncertainty, acoustic studies have added another layer of complexity. Microphones and vibration sensors record low-frequency hums, dripping sounds, and subtle shifting that do not always correspond to any known source. In some cases, sound appears to emanate from side chambers without detectable airflow or water movement, producing sequences that resemble footsteps or tapping. Analysis has yet to determine whether these are anomalies of perception, natural echoes amplified by the cave's geometry, or phenomena that remain unexplained. Each expedition contributes new recordings, yet the patterns remain inconsistent, reinforcing the cave's reputation as a place where technology illuminates and obscures simultaneously. Long-duration observation experiments have also been undertaken. Teams have camped for days at a time near entrances and within larger chambers, documenting environmental changes, animal activity, and subtle shifts in floor sediments. These studies reveal that even minor natural changes, fallen leaves, condensation, or small rock slides can produce patterns mistaken for deliberate movement. Yet some traces persist beyond explanation, impressions in sediment that recur, subtle noises unaccounted for by instruments, and shapes in low light that appear and vanish. The interplay between observation, technology, and the cave's mutable conditions ensures that certainty remains elusive. Despite every effort to record, measure, and analyze, Ape Cave remains a threshold of uncertainty. Modern tools capture data with precision, yet the cave continues to resist definitive interpretation, producing as many questions as answers. Observers report moments when the cave feels almost sentient, revealing fragments of activity while withholding the full picture. Technology offers glimpses into its structure, patterns, and anomalies, but it cannot entirely bridge the gap between observation and understanding. In this space, human curiosity is measured against the cave's enduring unpredictability, reminding every visitor that Ape Cave's mysteries are as deeply embedded in the rock and shadow as they are in the forest above. Beneath the mossed canopy and the twisting lava tubes, Ape Cave endures, offering only fragments of its truth while guarding the rest in silence that no light, instrument, or human curiosity has yet fully pierced.